We often talk about the fall of the Roman Empire as if it was some sudden cataclysmic implosion, a single dramatic collapse into dust and barbarians. But what if I told you that, in a sense, it never really fell at all? What if, instead, it simply moved house, packed its bags, and set up shop somewhere new, evolving into something both familiar and utterly transformed? That's where our story truly begins, with an emperor who had a grand vision and, frankly, a bit of a knack for real estate. We're talking about Constantine the Great, a man whose decision to build a new capital city fundamentally rewrote the map of antiquity, and in doing so, laid the very first brick of what would become the magnificent, complex, and often misunderstood Byzantine Empire. Imagine, if you will, the sheer audacity of it, abandoning the venerable, if somewhat crumbling glory of Rome for a fresh start. A virgin landscape chosen for its strategic brilliance, where Europe met Asia, where trade winds whispered secrets from distant lands, and where a new Christian faith could truly flourish, free from the lingering pagan shadows of the old gods. This wasn't just a practical move. It was a profound statement, a declaration that the future of the Roman world lay not in its ancient heart, but in a vibrant, strategically superior location, a place destined to become the unparalleled nexus of power, wealth, and culture for 1,000 years. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Constantine, a pragmatic visionary, wasn't just looking for a nice view. He was eyeing a choke point, a natural fortress. He settled upon the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, perched majestically on the Bosphorus Strait. You see, this narrow waterway was, and still is, the only maritime link between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, making it an economic goldmine and an easily defensible position. It was almost as if Mother Nature herself had designed it to be an imperial capital. The year was 330 CE, and with great pomp and circumstance, and no small amount of architectural ambition, the city was formally dedicated as Nova Roma, the New Rome. Though, as often happens with nicknames, the populace had a more personal preference, quickly dubbing it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. It had 7 hills, just like the original Rome, and Constantine spared no expense in adorning it with forums, baths, a massive hippodrome for chariot races, because what's an empire without its entertainment? And, crucially, churches. This was a city built not just on strategic foresight, but on the burgeoning power of Christianity, a faith that Constantine himself had embraced after his rather dramatic conversion experience before the Battle of Milvian Bridge. Historians still argue whether Constantine's conversion was a genuine spiritual awakening or a shrewd political calculation, given the growing number of Christians in the empire. Perhaps it was a bit of both, a masterful blend of piety and pragmatism. Either way, this imperial embrace fundamentally shifted the religious landscape of the empire, setting the stage for Christianity to become the dominant force it is today. And just like any good contractor, Constantine made sure his new city had all the mod cons, even if the mod cons of the 4th century involved elaborate aqueducts and grand basilicas rather than Wi-Fi and smart homes. Imagine the sheer logistical nightmare of building such a city from scratch shipping in marble, statues, and skilled artisans from across the vast Roman world. It was an undertaking that would make modern urban planners weep into their blueprints, yet it was accomplished with remarkable speed and an almost dizzying level of grandeur. This wasn't just a city, it was a statement, a declaration that the Roman Empire was not just surviving, but actively reinventing itself, a phoenix rising from the ashes of its own increasingly unwieldy past, spreading its new Christianized wings over the East. And so Constantinople, a city born of ambition and strategic genius, began its long, illustrious, and often turbulent journey as the beating heart of an empire that would, for centuries, be the envy, the beacon, and occasionally the bane of the known world. So we've laid the cornerstone of Constantinople, a gleaming new capital firmly rooted in a changing world. But a city, as grand as it was, isn't an empire on its own. It needed more than just impressive architecture. It needed a soul, a purpose, and a guiding hand. And that, dear listener, brings us back to Constantine himself, because his legacy wasn't just about bricks and mortar. It was profoundly about Christianity and the way it permeated every layer of this nascent Eastern Roman state. Remember how we hinted that his conversion wasn't just a personal journey? Well, it absolutely wasn't. It was an imperial endorsement that reverberated through the centuries, transforming a once persecuted fringe religion into the very fabric of state and society. Imagine the sheer cultural whiplash for citizens who, for generations, had seen emperors as divine figures, part of a pantheon of gods. Now the emperor bowed before a single, invisible deity and expected his subjects to follow suit. This wasn't a slow, gentle shift. It was a revolution, albeit one that played out over decades, sometimes violently. Constantine's actions in promoting Christianity were multifaceted and strategic. He showered the church with imperial patronage, funding the construction of magnificent basilicas, like the original Hagia Sophia in Constantinople or the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He granted clergy special privileges, exempting them from certain taxes and civic duties, which, as you can imagine, made being a priest a rather appealing career path for some. It's almost as if he created an early form of clerical benefits package, long before HR departments were even a twinkle in a bureaucrat's eye. More importantly, he used his imperial authority to intervene in theological disputes, believing that religious unity was crucial for political stability. This is where things get really interesting and occasionally a bit messy. The early Christian church was anything but monolithic. It was a vibrant, often fractious collection of differing interpretations and regional variations. The most pressing issue during Constantine's time was the Arian controversy, a fierce debate over the nature of Christ. Was Jesus co-eternal with God the Father, or was he a created being subordinate to God? This wasn't just theological hair-splitting. It had profound implications for salvation and the very essence of Christian belief. To resolve this escalating crisis, Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. Think of it as the first major international church conference, complete with all the drama, strong personalities, and probably too much catering that you'd expect. Bishops from across the empire gathered, some still bearing the scars of past persecutions, to hash out the doctrinal issues. Constantine, though not a baptized Christian himself at this point, he waited until his deathbed, a common practice then, perhaps, to wash away a lifetime of imperial sins in one go, presided over the council. His presence underscored the unprecedented role the emperor now played in ecclesiastical affairs, a tradition that would become a defining characteristic of the Byzantine Empire, Caesaropapism, where the emperor held significant authority over both temporal and spiritual matters. The Council of Nicaea ultimately condemned Arianism and produced the Nicene Creed, a statement of faith still recited in many Christian churches today. This wasn't the end of Arianism, mind you. It continued to be a thorn in the side of the empire for centuries, especially among some Germanic tribes. But Nicaea set a precedent. The emperor was the defender of orthodoxy, and the state had a vested interest in the church's unity. Beyond religion, Constantine also laid some crucial groundwork for the future administrative structure of the East. He reorganized the empire into new dioceses and prefectures, streamlining governance and creating a more centralized bureaucracy. This was a critical step in differentiating the East from the West, as the western half of the empire would increasingly fragment under barbarian pressures. His economic policies, including the introduction of a stable gold coin, the solidus, which would remain the standard for centuries, a true testament to its reliability. Imagine a currency that holds its value for 1,000 years, provided a much-needed boost to trade and stability. These were not minor tweaks. They were systemic changes that fostered a distinct Eastern Roman identity, one that was increasingly Greek in language and culture, even as it clung fiercely to its Roman heritage. Historians still argue whether Constantine's institutional reforms, more than his religious policies, were the true bedrock upon which Byzantium was built, creating a durable administrative skeleton that could withstand the coming storms. So, while the Western Empire slowly spiraled into decline, beset by economic woes, internal strife, and relentless barbarian incursions, Constantinople, under Constantine's guiding hand, was flourishing. It became a magnet for talent, wealth, and innovation. The old Roman aristocracy might have sniffed at this new Rome, but the power, the money, and the future were undeniably shifting eastward. It was like watching a once dominant tech company slowly fade, while a nimble startup, built on new ideas and strategic locations, began to truly take off. Constantine wasn't just building a city. He was cultivating an entirely new imperial ethos, one that saw itself as the legitimate, continuous heir of Rome, yet was distinctively Christian and increasingly Hellenized. This dual identity, Roman and Christian, would be a defining tension and strength of the Byzantine Empire for its entire existence, a constant interplay between ancient tradition and new beliefs. And it all started with one man's vision, a very big city and a divine intervention, or perhaps a very clever political play, with Constantinople firmly established as the shining new capital and Christianity steadily woven into the very fabric of the empire. The stage was set for the next act in our enduring Roman drama. Constantine's passing in 337 CE, after a truly transformative reign, ushered in a period of complex transitions, familial squabbles, and the slow, inexorable process of the Roman Empire truly splitting into two distinct entities, one heading for a rather dramatic fall, and the other, our beloved Byzantium, settling in for a millennium-long marathon. This brings us to the Theodosian dynasty, a line of emperors who, in their own ways, solidified the legal and religious frameworks of the Eastern Roman Empire, even as they grappled with the increasingly desperate situation in the West. It was a time of consolidation, of drawing firmer lines in the imperial sand, both literally and figuratively, as the concept of a permanently divided empire became less a temporary administrative arrangement and more a fundamental reality. Imagine for a moment the vastness of the Roman Empire at this point. It stretched from the misty shores of Britain to the scorching deserts of Syria, an administrative nightmare even on a good day. Constantine had experimented with co-emperors, and after his death, his sons inherited the throne, carving up the empire amongst themselves. This wasn't unprecedented. Diocletian had tried a similar system with his tetrarchy, but what began as a pragmatic solution to govern an unwieldy territory gradually hardened into a permanent schism. The reign of Theodosius I, often called the Great, was pivotal in this regard. He was the last emperor to rule over a truly unified Roman Empire, however briefly. And what a reign it was! Theodosius, a devout Christian, took the Nicene Creed. Remember that little theological debate we talked about earlier? He took that and made it the official state religion in 380 CE with the Edict of Thessalonica. This was a game changer. Suddenly, paganism, which had merely been sidelined by Constantine, was actively suppressed. Temples were closed, cults were outlawed, and adherence to Orthodox Christianity became a civic duty. It was like going from a casual suggestion to a mandatory company policy, complete with consequences for non-compliance. Historians still argue whether Theodosius's zeal was a genuine reflection of his deep personal faith or a shrewd political move to rally the empire around a single, unifying ideology, particularly as barbarian pressures mounted. Perhaps, like Constantine, it was a skillful blend of both. Theodosius's fervent Christianity didn't just impact religious policy. It often led to fascinating, sometimes tense, interactions with powerful church figures. Think of his dramatic public penance at the insistence of Bishop Ambrose of Milan after the massacre at Thessalonica. This wasn't just a private confession. It was an emperor, the most powerful man in the world, humbling himself before a bishop. It was a stark visual representation of the growing moral authority of the Church, a relationship that would define the Byzantine state. The emperor was supreme, but even he had to contend with the spiritual power of the patriarch and the Church. This was a subtle but profound difference from the pagan Roman emperors, who were themselves considered divine. Upon Theodosius's death in 395 CE, the empire was formally and permanently divided between his two sons, Arcadius in the east, ruling from Constantinople, and Honorius in the west, ruling from Ravenna. Rome itself was becoming less and less a practical capital. This year, 395 CE, is often cited as the de facto birth date of the Byzantine Empire as a truly separate political entity. From this point forward, the two halves would pursue increasingly divergent paths. While the Western Empire staggered under the weight of migrating Germanic tribes, Visigoths sacking Rome in 410 CE, Vandals doing the same in 455 CE. They really lived up to their name, didn't they? The East, with its robust economy, formidable walls of Constantinople, and a more centralized administration, proved remarkably resilient. It's almost as if the East had invested in better home security, while the West left its doors unlocked. Theodosius II, Arcadius's son, continued to shape the Eastern Empire. His reign, 408–450 CE, saw the construction of the formidable Theodosian walls of Constantinople, a truly impressive feat of engineering that would protect the city for over 1,000 years. These triple layers of walls, interspersed with towers and moats, made Constantinople virtually impregnable to direct assault, a fact that would prove crucial time and time again against Avars, Arabs, and Bulgarians. It was the ultimate do not disturb sign for invaders. These walls weren't just defensive structures. They were symbols of Byzantine permanence and strength, a physical manifestation of their claim to be the true inheritors of Rome's power. Furthermore, Theodosius II was responsible for the Theodosian Code, a systematic compilation of Roman law issued in 438 CE. This massive legal undertaking codified existing imperial edicts and judgments, providing a foundational legal text that would influence not only the Eastern Empire, but also, to some extent, the emerging barbarian kingdoms in the West. It was like creating the world's first comprehensive legal database, making sure everyone knew what the rules were, even if they sometimes struggled to follow them. This code represented a significant step in the preservation and transmission of Roman law, a crucial intellectual legacy that Byzantium would safeguard. So, under the Theodosian dynasty, the Eastern Roman Empire solidified its distinct identity. It was Christian, increasingly Greek in language and culture, and strategically resilient, even as its Western counterpart began its long, painful decline. The division of the empire, the entrenchment of Orthodox Christianity, and the strengthening of Constantinople's defenses were all pieces of a grand puzzle falling into place, creating the distinct entity we know as Byzantium. It was a period where the Roman baton was passed, not dropped, but carried forward by new hands in a new direction, a direction that would allow this Eastern fragment to endure for an astonishing, unparalleled stretch of history, ready to face even greater challenges than the barbarian tribes at its gate. We've now firmly planted our Byzantine feet in Constantinople, protected by the formidable Theodosian walls, with a burgeoning Christian identity and a distinctly Eastern administrative structure taking shape. The Western Roman Empire, meanwhile, was slowly but surely fading into the annals of history, its final official fall just around the corner in 476 CE. But our story, the story of Byzantium, was just getting warmed up. After a string of relatively less impactful emperors following the Theodosians, the stage was set for a truly larger-than-life figure, a man whose ambitions were as vast as the empire he sought to restore, and whose reign would define an entire era. We are talking, of course, about Justinian the Firm, whose rule from 527 to 560 CE was a whirlwind of legal reform, architectural marvels, military campaigns, and, quite frankly, a biological catastrophe that nearly wiped out his grand plans. If Byzantium had a highlight reel, Justinian would certainly be the star player, hitting all the major points with an almost manic energy. Justinian's greatest and most enduring legacy, the one that still sends shivers of admiration down the spines of legal scholars, is undoubtedly his comprehensive codification of Roman law. Remember the Theodosian Code? That was just the warm-up act. Justinian, with his brilliant legal minister Tribonian, undertook the colossal task of systematically organizing and harmonizing centuries of Roman legal thought, from ancient laws and senatorial decrees to imperial edicts and the writings of jurists. This monumental effort resulted in the Corpus Juris Civilis, or body of civil law. This wasn't just a tidy-up. It was a Herculean feat of legal scholarship, consolidating what had become a bewildering maze of statutes and precedents into a cohesive logical system. It comprised several parts: the Code, a collection of imperial laws; the Digest, a compilation of legal opinions from renowned Roman jurists; the Institutes, a textbook for law students, because even back then you needed a crash course; and later, the Novellae, new laws issued by Justinian himself. This legal magnum opus profoundly influenced the legal systems of countless nations, forming the basis of civil law traditions across Europe and beyond. It's no exaggeration to say that if you're interacting with a legal system today that emphasizes written codes and systematic principles, you're likely seeing the ripple effect of Justinian's work. Historians still argue whether the Corpus Juris Civilis was primarily a backward-looking attempt to preserve classical Roman law, or a forward-thinking innovation that adapted it for a new era. Perhaps it was a masterful blend of both, a genius move to anchor the evolving Byzantine state to its Roman roots, while laying the groundwork for future legal development. But Justinian wasn't just a legal eagle. He was a builder, a patron of the arts, and a man with a serious eye for grandeur. His most iconic architectural achievement, and truly one of the wonders of the world, is the Hagia Sophia, meaning Holy Wisdom, in Constantinople. After the previous church on the site was destroyed during the devastating Nika riots in 532 CE, a surprisingly violent outburst by chariot racing factions, which nearly cost Justinian his throne. Turns out sports fans were just as passionate and dangerous back then as they are now. Justinian famously declared, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee," when he beheld the completed dome. And he wasn't wrong. This colossal basilica, with its daringly massive dome seemingly suspended from heaven by a golden chain, was an engineering marvel, a testament to Byzantine ingenuity and faith. It was designed to awe, to inspire, and to convey the boundless power of both God and the emperor. Its sheer scale and innovative design still leave visitors speechless, even after nearly 1,500 years. However, Justinian's reign wasn't all sunshine and architectural triumphs. It was also marred by an unimaginable catastrophe, the Plague of Justinian. Beginning in 541 CE, this devastating pandemic, now believed to be caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same culprit as the Black Death, swept across the empire, wiping out an estimated 25–50% of the population. Imagine half the people you know suddenly gone. Cities were depopulated, economies were shattered, and the empire's manpower for its ambitious military campaigns was severely depleted. Justinian himself contracted the plague but miraculously recovered, a testament to his tenacity, or perhaps just sheer luck. This plague wasn't just a demographic disaster. It had profound long-term consequences, weakening the empire just as new threats were emerging on its borders. It's a chilling reminder that even the grandest imperial designs can be undone by something invisible to the naked eye. Despite the plague, Justinian's ambition remained undimmed, particularly his dream of recovering the lost Western Roman Empire. This reconquest of former Roman territories would consume much of his reign and vast resources. He famously sent his brilliant general, Belisarius, to reclaim North Africa from the Vandals, and then, more arduously, Italy from the Ostrogoths. These campaigns, while initially successful and incredibly daring, were brutally long and costly, bleeding the empire of men and money. The story of Belisarius, a general of almost mythical competence, winning against overwhelming odds, is fascinating in itself. Even if his later career ended in imperial suspicion and political eclipse, Justinian's reign truly embodied the Byzantine ideal of a renewed Roman Empire, even if the enormous costs of his ambitions would inevitably create new vulnerabilities for his successors. His legacy, therefore, is a complex tapestry of unparalleled achievement, immense suffering, and far-reaching consequences that would shape the empire for centuries to come. So Justinian, our grand imperial architect and legal eagle, had just about wrapped up his reign, leaving behind monumental legal codes, awe-inspiring buildings like the Hagia Sophia, and a plague-ridden landscape. But while his domestic achievements were certainly impressive, his most consuming passion, the one that truly drained the imperial coffers and stretched the empire's resources to their absolute limit, was his relentless, almost quixotic quest for reconquest. This brings us to the harsh realities of Justinian's grand vision, clashing with practical imperial limits, a poignant tale of ambition versus sustainability. He genuinely believed it was the sacred duty of the Roman emperor to reclaim what was once Rome's, to reunite the fragments of the old empire and restore its former glory. It was a noble, if incredibly expensive dream, fueled by a deep sense of imperial destiny. Let's talk strategy. Justinian's main targets were the barbarian kingdoms that had carved up the Western Roman Empire, the Vandals in North Africa, and the Ostrogoths in Italy. These were not small-time raids. These were full-scale, multi-year military campaigns requiring vast fleets, seasoned armies, and seemingly endless supplies of gold. His chosen instrument for these endeavors was his most brilliant general, Belisarius. Imagine a military genius on par with Caesar or Alexander, but operating in a different, more complicated era. Belisarius's campaigns read like something out of an epic poem. In 533 CE, with a surprisingly small force, he utterly crushed the Vandal kingdom in North Africa in a swift, decisive campaign, reclaiming the wealthy grain provinces for the empire. It was an astonishing victory, a tactical masterpiece that sent shockwaves through the barbarian world. The ease with which he achieved it probably gave Justinian a false sense of security about the rest of his grand plan. However, the reconquest of Italy from the Ostrogoths was a far, far different beast. This wasn't a quick knockout. It was a grueling, brutal, almost 20-year-long war that devastated the Italian peninsula. Starting in 535 CE, the Gothic Wars were characterized by sieges, betrayals, pitched battles, and immense suffering for the civilian population. Cities like Rome changed hands multiple times, their ancient monuments scarred by the fighting. Belisarius, despite his tactical brilliance, often found himself short on troops and resources, constantly pleading with Justinian for reinforcements and funds from a plague-stricken Constantinople. It was a logistical nightmare, trying to project power thousands of miles away across hostile seas into a land ravaged by war and disease. Historians still argue whether the long-term devastation caused by these wars in Italy outweighed any strategic benefits of reconquest. Was it truly worth turning a once flourishing land into a wasteland? While Belisarius was slogging it out in Italy, another brilliant general, Narses, eventually replaced him and finally brought the Gothic Wars to a conclusion in 554 CE. Narses, though not as famous as Belisarius, was an equally capable commander, proving that Justinian had a knack for picking talent, even if he didn't always fully trust them. A common imperial flaw, alas. By the end of Justinian's reign, the empire had indeed reclaimed significant portions of the old Roman West, North Africa, Italy, and a foothold in southern Spain, which was a short-lived conquest. From a purely territorial perspective, it was a massive achievement. The Roman Mediterranean was largely, if fleetingly, reunited under Byzantine control. But here's the kicker. The cost was crippling. The endless wars had emptied the imperial treasury, leaving it deeply in debt. The constant drain of manpower, exacerbated by the plague of Justinian, left the empire vulnerable on its eastern and northern frontiers. The newly conquered territories were often ruined economically and difficult to administer, requiring substantial garrisons to maintain control. It was a bit like buying a fixer-upper mansion, spending every last penny to restore it, only to realize you can't afford the upkeep and your roof is leaking badly back home. These reconquests weren't integrated seamlessly. They were fragile extensions, constantly under threat. Furthermore, these exhausting Western campaigns meant that the empire's traditional eastern frontier, with the powerful Sasanian Persian Empire, often had to be managed with diplomacy and subsidies rather than decisive military action. While Justinian did achieve a perpetual peace with Persia in 532 CE, it was short-lived and required significant payments. Later, renewed conflicts with Persia and the Avars and Slavs pushing down from the Balkans would expose just how stretched the empire had become. It was a constant game of whack-a-mole on multiple borders. The irony is that by focusing so heavily on recreating the old Roman Empire in the West, Justinian inadvertently weakened the core of the Eastern Empire, making it less capable of defending itself against the entirely new threats that were soon to emerge from the Arabian Peninsula. So while Justinian's ambition was truly monumental, his grand reconquests, for all their initial glory, ultimately stretched the Byzantine Empire beyond its sustainable limits. He left his successors an empire that was territorially larger, but financially exhausted, demographically depleted, and facing new formidable challenges on every front. His reign a testament to what an emperor could achieve with sheer will and brilliant subordinates. But it was also a cautionary tale about the perils of overextension. The dream of reuniting Rome had been pursued with relentless vigor, but the reality was a fractured world, and Byzantium, while surviving, was now a different, more vulnerable beast, poised on the brink of even greater transformations. The stage was set for a period of immense struggle and profound change, far from the nostalgic echoes of a reunited Roman past. Justinian's grand dream of Roman reunification, though achieved in part, had left the empire financially depleted and geographically overstretched. The vast expenses of his Western campaigns and the devastating demographic impact of the plague of Justinian meant that his successors inherited an empire that, while technically larger, was severely weakened at its core. And as we all know, when one empire shows signs of weakness, new threats inevitably emerge from the shadows, eager to test its resolve. This brings us to the crucial period dominated by the Heraclean dynasty, a turbulent but ultimately transformative era where the Byzantine Empire faced an existential struggle against the resurgent Persian Empire and the entirely new, utterly revolutionary force of Islam. This was not just a difficult patch. This was a fight for survival that would redefine the empire's very nature. Imagine the situation. The Byzantine Empire was still calling itself Roman, but it was increasingly Greek in culture and language, and its focus was undeniably eastward. The long-standing rivalry with the Sasanian Persian Empire, a titanic struggle that had waxed and waned for centuries, was about to reach its terrifying climax. Emperor Maurice, a capable predecessor, had managed to stabilize things for a while, but his overthrow and murder in 602 CE by a usurper named Phocas plunged the empire into chaos. This internal strife was like an open invitation to the Persians. Under their ambitious king, Khusrau II, the Sasanians launched a massive invasion, aiming to restore the ancient Achaemenid Persian Empire and potentially even destroy the Byzantine state. It was a war of unprecedented scale and brutality, far exceeding anything seen since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Persian advance was terrifyingly successful. They captured key Byzantine cities in Mesopotamia, Armenia, Syria, and Palestine. In 614 CE, Jerusalem fell to Persian forces, and the True Cross, a revered Christian relic, was carried off to Persia. Imagine the psychological blow. It was as if the heart of Christendom had been ripped out. The Persians even reached the shores of the Bosphorus, directly threatening Constantinople, while the Avars and Slavs hammered at the empire's northern borders. The Byzantine Empire was on the brink of collapse, squeezed from every direction. It truly seemed like the end of days for the Romans of the East. In this moment of profound crisis, a new hero emerged, Heraclius. He sailed from North Africa, where his father was an exarch, deposed the tyrannical Phocas, and was crowned emperor in 610 CE. Heraclius inherited an empire teetering on the abyss, but he was no ordinary emperor. He was a man of extraordinary courage, strategic genius, and deep faith. He spent years reforming the army, raising funds, and even personally leading campaigns, a highly unusual move for a Roman emperor. He transformed the empire's military structure, implementing the theme system, which organized provinces into military districts, where soldiers were granted land in exchange for hereditary military service. This ingenious system helped to create a self-sustaining local defense force, a crucial innovation for an empire stretched thin. Historians still argue whether the theme system was a deliberate top-down reform or a more organic evolution in response to military pressures, but its effectiveness is beyond doubt. Then, in a series of daring and brilliant counteroffensives between 622 and 628 CE, Heraclius took the fight directly to the Persians, launching deep incursions into their heartland. He systematically defeated Khusrau's armies, culminating in the decisive Battle of Nineveh in 627 CE. It was a stunning reversal of fortune, an almost miraculous victory that brought the Persian Empire to its knees. The Byzantines recovered all lost territories, and the true cross was triumphantly returned to Jerusalem. It seemed like a new golden age was dawning, a testament to Byzantine resilience. The empire had stared into the abyss and pulled itself back. But just as the Byzantines and Persians were utterly exhausted from their epic struggle, something entirely new and unforeseen burst onto the world stage. Islam. From the Arabian Peninsula, united by the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, highly motivated and militarily effective Arab armies exploded outwards, driven by religious fervor and a desire for expansion. Both Byzantium and Persia, having just bled each other dry, were totally unprepared for this new dynamic force. The speed and scale of the early Muslim conquests were astonishing. Beginning in the 630s, the Arabs swiftly conquered Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, some of the wealthiest and most populous provinces of the Byzantine Empire. Heraclius, the hero who had saved the empire from Persia, found himself unable to stem the tide. The Byzantines suffered devastating defeats at battles like Yarmouk in 636 CE, which effectively sealed the fate of Syria. Egypt, the empire's breadbasket, fell soon after. Within a few decades, Byzantium had lost 2/3 of its territory and most of its vital tax revenues. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, was now contested, and naval power became paramount. It was a humbling, shocking blow, coming so soon after their great victory over Persia. This period was truly a pivot point. The empire shrank dramatically, becoming more compact and defensible, centered primarily on Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, the Balkans, and the capital, Constantinople. This dramatic territorial loss forced the empire to adapt, to become more militarized, and to shed some of its remaining Latinate characteristics as it became almost entirely Greek in language and culture. The challenges posed by Persia and the advent of Islam didn't just transform the empire's borders. They forged its very identity, hardening it into a resilient, beleaguered fortress state that would, against all odds, continue to endure. The Arab conquests had dramatically reshaped the Byzantine Empire, shrinking its borders and forcing it to adapt to a new, perpetually hostile geopolitical reality. With vast swathes of its richest territories gone, Byzantium became a more compact, militarized state, constantly on guard against the burgeoning Islamic Caliphate. But as if external threats weren't enough, the empire was about to plunge into one of its most profound and divisive internal struggles, one that would rage for over a century and deeply affect its spiritual and political identity. The Iconoclast Controversy. This wasn't just a theological debate. It was a socio-political earthquake that split the empire down the middle, turning neighbor against neighbor and even emperor against pope. Imagine, if you will, an argument so fierce that it leads to widespread destruction of art, excommunication, and even civil strife, all centered around whether it was acceptable to venerate religious images. Sounds a bit extreme for a picture, doesn't it? The controversy, which roughly spanned from 726 to 843 CE, centered on the use and veneration of icons, painted images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and saints. For centuries, these icons had been an integral part of Byzantine religious life. They were seen as windows to the divine, aids to prayer, and expressions of faith. People knelt before them, kissed them, and believed they could perform miracles. They were, in essence, a very tangible connection to the spiritual realm. However, a growing movement, influenced perhaps by interactions with Islam, which strictly forbade idolatry, and certain Old Testament prescriptions against graven images, began to argue that venerating icons was akin to idolatry, a violation of the second commandment. This was not a subtle nuance. It was a direct challenge to deeply ingrained religious practices. The first major phase of iconoclasm was initiated by Emperor Leo III, the Isaurian, in 726 CE. Leo was a strong military man, credited with successfully defending Constantinople against a massive Arab siege in 718 CE, and he believed that the empire's recent military setbacks and natural disasters were a sign of divine displeasure brought on by the sin of icon worship. He began issuing edicts against the veneration of icons, ordering their removal and even destruction. Imagine the shock and outrage. For many, particularly the monks and ordinary people, this was an attack on their faith, their traditions, and their spiritual comfort. It was like suddenly being told your most cherished family photos were actually evil. The opposition was fierce. Monasteries, which were major producers and custodians of icons, became hotbeds of resistance. Famous figures like St. John of Damascus, writing from outside Byzantine territory, eloquently defended the use of icons, arguing that since Christ, the invisible God, had taken on visible human form, it was permissible to depict him. He distinguished between veneration, respect shown to the image as a representation of the divine prototype, and worship, adoration due only to God. This distinction was crucial to the iconophile, icon lover argument. The controversy also had significant political ramifications. The popes in Rome vehemently opposed iconoclasm, further widening the growing rift between the Eastern and Western churches. In some parts of the empire, notably Greece, there were even armed revolts against imperial iconoclast policies. It wasn't just a theological debate, it was a struggle for power between the emperor, the church, and different factions within society. Historians still debate whether iconoclasm was primarily driven by Leo's sincere religious conviction, a desire to curb the growing power and wealth of the monasteries, or an attempt to make the empire more ideologically uniform in the face of Islamic threats. It was probably a complex stew of all these factors. The first iconoclast period lasted until 787 CE, when Empress Irene, an ardent iconophile, convened the Second Council of Nicaea. This council formally condemned iconoclasm and restored the veneration of icons. For a brief period, it seemed the empire had found peace on this front. However, the controversy wasn't truly over. A second wave of iconoclasm erupted in 815 CE under Emperor Leo V, fueled by renewed military defeats and the belief that God was still displeased. This second period was less severe, but still resulted in further destruction and persecution. It was almost as if the empire couldn't quite make up its mind on what was acceptable artistic expression in a religious context. The final triumph of the iconophiles came in 843 CE under Empress Theodora, a regent for her young son Michael III. She, along with the Patriarch Methodius, definitively ended iconoclasm, restoring icons throughout the empire. This event, known as the Triumph of Orthodoxy, is still celebrated annually in the Eastern Orthodox Church on the first Sunday of Lent. It wasn't just a victory for religious art. It was a victory for the authority of the church councils over imperial theological dictates, and it cemented the unique understanding of religious imagery that characterizes Eastern Orthodoxy to this day. The Iconoclast Controversy had profound consequences. It solidified the Byzantine Empire's unique theological identity, distinct from the emerging Latin West. It strengthened the position of monasticism, which had heroically resisted the imperial decree. It also, tragically, led to the destruction of countless irreplaceable works of early Byzantine art, making what survived even more precious. But most importantly, it served as a brutal, protracted internal struggle that, while painful, ultimately helped forge a more unified religious and cultural identity for the empire as it emerged from the shadow of the Arab conquests, ready for a new phase of its long and often tumultuous history. With the tumultuous Iconoclast controversy finally settled in favor of the icons, and the empire, though smaller, having successfully fended off existential threats from the Arabs and forged a more distinct identity, Byzantium was poised for remarkable resurgence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a more refined, more resilient state. This brings us to a golden age, a period of renewed military strength, administrative stability, and a flourishing of arts and letters that would echo the glories of earlier Roman times. The rise of the Macedonian dynasty. This wasn't just a new line of emperors. It was a revitalizing force that propelled the Byzantine Empire back onto the world stage as a dominant power, marking a true zenith in its long history. The dynasty officially began with Basil I, who came to power in 867 CE, ironically, through a rather unsavory act of regicide. He assassinated his benefactor, Emperor Michael III. Not exactly a fairy tale start, is it? But despite his humble, somewhat murky origins, he was allegedly of Armenian peasant stock, though he claimed Macedonian ancestry, hence the dynasty's name. Basil proved to be an exceptionally capable ruler. He was a reformer, a legislator, and a surprisingly effective military commander. He cleaned up the bureaucracy, stabilized the empire's finances, and even initiated new legal reforms, building upon Justinian's legacy. It was as if the empire had finally gotten its second wind after centuries of struggle. And Basil was the one jogging them along. Under Basil and his successors, the empire entered a period of military expansion, often referred to as the Byzantine Reconquista. The main targets were the Arabs, who had, for centuries, been a constant thorn in Byzantium's side, raiding its coasts and holding vast former Roman territories. The Byzantines launched sustained campaigns to reclaim land in Anatolia, Syria, and even parts of Sicily and southern Italy. They developed new military tactics and technologies, including the formidable Greek fire, a mysterious incendiary weapon that could burn on water, striking terror into the hearts of enemy fleets. Imagine being on an enemy ship and seeing liquid flame being sprayed onto your deck, refusing to be extinguished by water. It was the ancient world's equivalent of a superweapon, and the Byzantines guarded its secret formula with extreme jealousy. The emperors of this dynasty were, by and large, a remarkable group. Leo VI the Wise, 86-912 CE, though more intellectual than martial, continued legal reforms and oversaw a cultural revival. His collection of laws, the Basilica, was an enormous undertaking, further streamlining and updating the Corpus Juris Civilis. Then came military strongmen like Romanos I Lecapenus, who was co-emperor but the power behind the throne, and most notably Nikephoros II Phocas, 963-969 CE, and John the Firm Tzimiskis, 969-976 CE. These two, in particular, were brilliant generals who led the Byzantine armies to stunning victories, pushing the imperial borders deep into Syria, reclaiming Antioch, and even reaching the Euphrates. The empire's prestige soared. Diplomatic missions from far-off lands, including Kievan Rus' and Western European kingdoms, regularly visited Constantinople, seeking alliances and marveling at its wealth and sophistication. But the true apex of this period, the very shining star of the Macedonian dynasty, was Basil II, known as the Bulgar-Slayer, 976-1025 CE. This name alone should give you a hint about his personality and primary obsession. His entire reign was largely dedicated to the conquest of the First Bulgarian Empire, a powerful and long-standing rival in the Balkans. The Byzantines and Bulgarians had been locked in a bitter struggle for centuries, a constant dance of raids, treaties, and pitched battles. Basil II, a relentless and iron-willed military genius, methodically dismantled the Bulgarian state in a series of brutal campaigns that lasted for decades. His most famous and chilling victory came at the Battle of Clydion in 1014 CE. After this decisive Byzantine triumph, Basil reportedly ordered the blinding of 14,000 captured Bulgarian soldiers, leaving one in every 100 with a single eye to guide the others home. This act, while horrifying by modern standards, was intended as a psychological blow so severe that it would break Bulgarian resistance once and for all. And it worked. By 1018 CE, the First Bulgarian Empire was completely incorporated into the Byzantine Empire. Basil II's reign wasn't just about military might. He was also a shrewd administrator, carefully managing the empire's finances and accumulating a massive surplus. He strengthened the central government and curbed the power of the landed aristocracy, ensuring that power remained firmly in the hands of the emperor. He was a micromanager in the best sense, keeping a tight rein on everything from military campaigns to agricultural policies. Historians still debate whether Basil II's brutal tactics, particularly the blinding of the Bulgarians, were a necessary evil for the long-term security of the empire, or a stain on his otherwise impressive legacy? It's a complicated question, reflecting the harsh realities of medieval warfare. The Macedonian period also saw a remarkable renaissance in arts, literature, and scholarship. Constantinople became the intellectual capital of the world. Scholars meticulously copied and preserved classical Greek texts, ensuring their survival for future generations. Magnificent mosaics adorned churches, depicting scenes with vibrant colors and intricate details. Silk production became a major industry, and Byzantine luxury goods were coveted across Europe and Asia. It was a time of confidence, stability, and cultural efflorescence, a stark contrast to the relative intellectual stagnation of much of Western Europe during the same period. This was Byzantium at its most vibrant and influential, a beacon of civilization in a still developing world. The empire had truly found its stride, reclaiming its place as a great power, basking in the glow of its military and cultural achievements, seemingly unstoppable. But history, as we know, has a cruel habit of introducing new challenges, even after periods of unparalleled triumph. The Macedonian dynasty, particularly under the formidable Basil II, had brought the Byzantine Empire to an unparalleled peak of power and prestige. The Bulgarians, for centuries a persistent and often terrifying thorn in Byzantium's side, had been decisively crushed, and the empire's borders stretched across Anatolia and the Balkans. The coffers were full, the military was strong, and Constantinople was the undisputed cultural and intellectual capital of the Christian world. But even the most glorious golden ages are, by their very nature, impermanent. As we transition from the absolute zenith of Basil II's reign, we begin to see the subtle cracks, the internal stresses that would, despite the empire's apparent strength, lead to a slow, almost imperceptible decline before a dramatic resurgence. Our focus here, then, is directly on the Bulgarian wars under Basil II and how his iron will, while bringing triumph, also left a rather indelible and some might say brutal mark on the empire's history. Imagine the historical context. The First Bulgarian Empire, founded in the 7th century, had been a formidable rival to Byzantium for over 300 years. They were a constant source of raids, land disputes, and outright warfare, often threatening Constantinople itself. Remember the iconic image of Basil II, the Bulgar-Slayer. That wasn't just a catchy nickname. It was a testament to his life's single-minded obsession. The complete subjugation of Bulgaria. This wasn't a quick campaign. It was a multi-decade grinding war of attrition, a relentless Byzantine advance against a tenacious enemy. Basil III understood that for the empire to truly thrive, this chronic threat on its doorstep had to be eliminated, not merely contained. He didn't just want to win battles. He wanted to win the war, definitively and permanently. Basil's early years on the throne, he became emperor in 976 CE, were fraught with internal rebellions from powerful aristocratic families, a common problem for Byzantine emperors who weren't born into absolute power. But once he had consolidated his grip on the throne, often with ruthless efficiency, his gaze turned almost entirely westward, to the Balkans, and to his nemesis, Tsar Samuel of Bulgaria. Samuel was no pushover. He was a cunning and effective leader who had rebuilt Bulgarian strength and expanded its territory, even reaching deep into Byzantine Greece. This was a personal, as well as an imperial grudge match, a clash of titans for regional supremacy. The war involved numerous sieges, skirmishes, and pitched battles. Basil II meticulously planned his campaigns, often personally leading his armies into the field, enduring harsh conditions alongside his soldiers. A stark contrast to some earlier, more sedentary emperors. He would spend years campaigning in the Balkans, building fortresses, and gradually grinding down Bulgarian resistance. It was a strategy of methodical destruction, slowly strangling the Bulgarian state through continuous pressure. He understood logistics and supply lines better than many of his adversaries, ensuring his armies were well fed and equipped, even in difficult terrain. It was a masterclass in sustained military pressure. The decisive moment came in 1014 CE at the Battle of Clydion, sometimes called the Battle of Belisitsa Pass. Basil II's forces managed to encircle the main Bulgarian army in a narrow mountain pass. The victory was total and overwhelming for the Byzantines. And this is where the story takes a grim, but historically significant, turn. After the battle, Basil II captured some 14,000 to 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers. His order regarding these prisoners earned him his chilling epithet. He commanded that they all be blinded, with the exception of 1/100th of the men, who were left with a single eye to lead their sightless comrades back to Tsar Samuel. Imagine that sight. Thousands of blinded men stumbling home, guided by a handful of their partially sighted peers. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare, designed to utterly break the spirit of the Bulgarian people and their ruler. Tsar Samuel reportedly suffered a stroke and died 2 days after seeing his shattered army return. While undeniably brutal, this act was tragically effective. It completely demoralized the Bulgarians, and within 4 years, by 1018 CE, the First Bulgarian Empire was completely annexed by Byzantium. The empire now stretched from southern Italy to the Caucasus, and from the Danube to Syria. It was, arguably, its greatest territorial extent since the Arab conquests. This wasn't just a victory, it was an absorption. Basil II didn't just defeat Bulgaria, he integrated it into the Byzantine administrative system, initially with a relatively light hand, allowing local elites to retain some power, and wisely not imposing heavy taxes. This shrewd post-war policy helped ensure the conquered territories remained relatively stable, contributing to the empire's renewed strength. Basil II's reign also saw continued pressure on the Eastern Front against the Arabs and a firm hand in dealing with internal aristocratic revolts. His long and effective reign, however, did have one crucial oversight. He failed to secure a clear succession. He was a man who preferred war to marriage, and when he died childless in 1025 CE, the Macedonian dynasty began a slow, inevitable decline, dominated by less competent emperors and increasingly powerful civil bureaucrats and court eunuchs. This internal power struggle, coupled with the erosion of the theme system, that clever military land arrangement we discussed earlier, as local landlords amassed more power, would gradually weaken the empire's military capabilities. Historians still debate whether Basil II's focus on conquest at the expense of a secure dynastic succession ultimately doomed the empire to its later troubles. Did he win the war, but lose the long-term peace for his dynasty? Nevertheless, the legacy of Basil II and his Bulgarian wars was profound. He secured the Balkans for centuries, removing a critical strategic threat and allowing Byzantium to truly dominate southeastern Europe. His reign exemplified Byzantine power at its peak. A highly centralized state, a formidable army, and an emperor with an iron will. It was a moment when Byzantium truly lived up to its claim as the legitimate heir to Rome, a powerhouse of both military might and cultural sophistication. But the wheel of fortune, as it always does, was about to turn, and new, unforeseen challenges were just over the horizon, ready to test the empire's resilience once more. The immense power and stability forged by Basil II, the Bulgar-Slayer, had unfortunately begun to unravel shortly after his death in 1025 CE. Without his iron grip and strategic genius, the Macedonian dynasty spiraled into a period of weak emperors, internal squabbles between the military aristocracy and the civilian bureaucracy in Constantinople, and a gradual decay of the very military and administrative systems that had made the empire so strong. It was as if the engine that Basil had so meticulously tuned suddenly lost its master mechanic, and everyone started fiddling with the gears. This chaotic period of decline set the stage for a critical juncture in Byzantine history, one that would see the empire facing new, unprecedented threats and eventually require a remarkable family to step up and attempt to arrest the decline. This brings us to the Komnenian Restoration, a desperate but ultimately successful effort by a new dynasty to reclaim some of the empire's lost grandeur, facing off against Normans, Seljuks, and the increasingly complicated politics of Western Europe. Imagine the empire's borders at this time. To the west, the Normans, a rapidly expanding and fiercely ambitious group of warriors, were consolidating their power in southern Italy and Sicily, traditional Byzantine territories. Remember how Justinian had fought so hard to reclaim Italy? Well, now it was being chipped away by these formidable new adversaries, who were not above raiding Byzantine coasts and even threatening Greece. To the east, an even more profound threat was emerging: the Seljuk Turks. These nomadic warriors, originating from Central Asia, had converted to Islam and were rapidly building a powerful sultanate, expanding into Anatolia, the very heartland of Byzantine manpower and agriculture. The most catastrophic event of this period of decline, one that sent shockwaves through the empire and irrevocably altered its course, was the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 CE. This wasn't just a defeat, it was a disaster on an epic scale. The Byzantine army, led by Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes, was decisively routed by the Seljuks. Romanos himself was captured, a humiliating first for a Byzantine emperor. While he was eventually released, the immediate aftermath of Manzikert was chaos. The empire lost control over much of Anatolia, which was rapidly overrun by Seljuk Turks. Imagine losing your breadbasket, your recruiting ground, and your strategic depth all at once. It was a wound from which the empire would never fully recover, turning vast, once fertile plains into a new, hostile frontier. Historians still argue whether Manzikert was a total catastrophe or a symptom of deeper underlying problems, but its immediate impact was undeniably devastating. Adding to the woes, 1071 CE also saw the final loss of Bari, the last Byzantine stronghold in southern Italy, to the Normans. So, in a single year, the empire lost its key eastern territories and its last toehold in the west. It was like getting punched in the gut and then kicked while you were down. The empire was in desperate straits, plagued by civil wars, mercenary armies, and a hollowed-out treasury. The powerful military aristocracy, long suppressed by Basil II, now vied for power, tearing the empire apart from within. It was into this maelstrom that the Komnenos family rose. Their ascendancy marked a turning point, a desperate attempt to halt the freefall. The first major figure of this new era was Alexios III Komnenos, who seized the throne in 1081 CE. Alexios was a skilled general and a shrewd diplomat, possessed of the kind of pragmatic realism that was sorely needed. He faced an almost impossible task: fighting off the Normans, containing the Seljuks, dealing with nomadic Pechenegs in the Balkans, and managing a shattered economy. It was a juggling act worthy of a circus performer, except the stakes were the survival of an empire. Alexios, through a combination of military victories, clever diplomacy, and sometimes outright bribery, he paid off the Seljuks at times, for instance, began to stabilize the empire. He forged alliances, including a crucial, if problematic, one with Venice, granting them significant trade concessions in exchange for naval support. He rebuilt the army, relying more on loyal family members and foreign mercenaries, rather than the unreliable provincial forces. He also initiated a process of internal consolidation, strengthening the central government and attempting to bring order back to the fragmented administration. He wasn't just patching up holes, he was trying to rebuild the entire foundation. The Komnenian Restoration, therefore, was characterized by a renewed military vigor and a surprising degree of administrative competence. Alexios I, his son John II, Komnenos, known as John the Good, a rare compliment for a Byzantine emperor, perhaps indicating he wasn't prone to the usual imperial ruthlessness, and his grandson Manuel Fern Komnenos, who aimed to restore Byzantine dominance in the Mediterranean and engage with Western powers. All worked tirelessly to regain lost territory and reassert Byzantine authority. They campaigned extensively in Anatolia, pushing back the Seljuks and re-established influence in the Balkans. They also became heavily involved in Western European affairs, particularly through marital alliances with Western royal families aiming to play the Crusader states and European powers off against each other. It was a complex game of international diplomacy, played with a shaky hand but impressive skill. The Komnenoi, particularly Manuel, saw Byzantium as a vital player in the wider European system, engaging with the Holy Roman Emperor, the Pope, and the burgeoning Italian maritime republics. They used their immense wealth and cultural prestige to exert influence, even as their actual military power remained somewhat diminished from its Macedonian peak. They managed to push back the encroaching tide on several fronts, giving the empire another century of life and even a semblance of its former glory. But the effort was immense, and the tactics employed, particularly the increasing reliance on Western mercenaries and the complex diplomatic web with the West, would ultimately sow the seeds for future troubles. They were fighting not just for survival, but for a restoration that, while admirable, proved increasingly difficult to maintain in a rapidly changing world. The Komnenian emperors, particularly Alexios IX, had done a remarkable job of staving off immediate collapse, patching up the gaping wounds left by Manzikert and the Norman onslaught. They had shrewdly used diplomacy, military prowess, and a hefty dose of pragmatism to keep the empire afloat, even managing to recover some lost ground. But just as Alexios was battling for the very survival of his state, a new, unforeseen, and incredibly disruptive force burst onto the scene from Western Europe, one that would irrevocably alter the course of Byzantine history: the First Crusade. This wasn't just another localized conflict. It was a phenomenon, a massive armed pilgrimage driven by religious fervor, and it utterly changed the geopolitical landscape for Byzantium, transforming potential allies into deeply suspicious, often hostile visitors. Imagine Alexios I in the late 1090s. He's facing Seljuk Turks still firmly entrenched in Anatolia, Pechenegs causing trouble in the Balkans, and Normans eyeing his coastline. He sends an appeal to the West, specifically to Pope Urban II, for mercenary aid against the Turks. He wanted a few thousand skilled knights, maybe some experienced commanders. What he got instead was a human tidal wave. Pope Urban II, at the Council of Clermont in 1095 CE, brilliantly reframed Alexios's request into a grand holy war to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control. "God wills it" became the rallying cry, and suddenly tens of thousands of armed pilgrims, knights, peasants, and adventurers from across Western Europe were packing their bags and heading east, completely unprepared for the realities of the journey or the subtle complexities of Byzantine politics. The arrival of the Crusader armies at Constantinople was, to put it mildly, an absolute nightmare for Alexios. Can you imagine? You invite a few friends over for dinner, and an entire unruly football team shows up, hungry, heavily armed, and with very little respect for your house rules. These Westerners, often described by Byzantines as uncouth and barbaric, and often with good reason, had little understanding of the sophisticated ancient empire they were traversing. They frequently pillaged the countryside for supplies, caused disturbances, and had a very different concept of imperial authority. Alexios, the consummate diplomat, had to manage them, feed them, and crucially, extract oaths of fealty from their leaders, ensuring that any lands they recaptured from the Turks would be returned to Byzantine control. He knew perfectly well that these crusaders, for all their religious zeal, were also ambitious feudal lords looking for new territories. Historians still argue whether Alexios's efforts to control the Crusaders were a masterstroke of diplomacy or a necessary evil that ultimately backfired by introducing potentially hostile elements into his sphere of influence. Despite the mutual suspicion, the First Crusade was initially beneficial for Byzantium. The Crusader armies, particularly the skilled Norman and French knights, successfully carved a path through Seljuk territory, recapturing important Byzantine cities like Nicaea, the old city from the Council, and Antioch. These gains, however, often came with strings attached. The Crusader leaders, driven by their own ambitions, frequently established their own principalities, the so-called Crusader states, rather than simply handing over the conquered lands to the Byzantines. This immediately created new, often hostile neighbors for the empire, transforming what was supposed to be a limited assistance mission into a permanent, complicated entanglement. The Byzantine perception of the Crusades quickly soured. What started as an appeal for aid turned into a series of headaches and outright betrayals. While the Byzantines appreciated the temporary weakening of the Seljuks in Anatolia, they were deeply suspicious of the Westerners' long-term intentions. They viewed the Crusaders not as liberators, but as ignorant, greedy, and often treacherous barbarians who saw Byzantium as merely a stepping stone, or worse, a prize to be taken. This mutual distrust would fester and grow with each successive crusade, culminating in disaster later on. The First Crusade cemented Byzantium's direct involvement in Western European affairs in an unprecedented way. No longer could the empire maintain a dignified distance from the emerging powers of the Latin West. The Crusader states, situated on Byzantium's borders, became constant points of friction, requiring continuous diplomatic and military engagement. The Byzantine emperors often found themselves playing a complex game of alliances and counter-alliances, trying to balance the various Latin powers against each other and against the Muslim states to protect their own interests. It was a diplomatic high-wire act, made even more perilous by the fact that the Westerners often simply didn't understand or didn't care about Byzantine political nuances. So the First Crusade was a mixed blessing. It momentarily relieved pressure from the Seljuks in Anatolia and showcased the Komnenian emperor's diplomatic skill in navigating an incredibly difficult situation. But it also introduced an unpredictable, often hostile element into the Eastern Mediterranean, creating new rivalries and accelerating the growing estrangement between the Latin West and the Greek East. The arrival of these zealous, heavily armed pilgrims marked a pivotal moment, forcing Byzantium to contend with a world that was becoming increasingly interconnected and increasingly dangerous from multiple directions. The stage was set for future clashes, leading ultimately to the most traumatic event in Byzantine history. The Komnenian emperors had navigated the treacherous waters of the First Crusade with remarkable skill, even managing to extract some short-term benefits despite the inherent dangers. They continued to project an image of renewed strength, engaging with Western powers and attempting to reassert Byzantine dominance in the Mediterranean. But the underlying tensions between the Latin West and the Greek East, exacerbated by the Crusades, continued to simmer, a dangerous undercurrent beneath the surface of diplomacy and uneasy alliances. This simmering resentment, fueled by religious differences, economic rivalry, and cultural misunderstandings, would eventually boil over into the most devastating catastrophe in the entire history of the Byzantine Empire, the Fourth Crusade's betrayal. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was an act of profound treachery, a sack so brutal and unexpected that it crippled Byzantium beyond recovery, fundamentally altering the course of European history and setting the stage for the empire's final decline. Imagine the atmosphere in Constantinople in the early 13th century. It was still the largest, wealthiest, and most sophisticated city in Christendom, a beacon of learning and trade. Its immense walls, remember the Theodosian walls, had stood impregnable for centuries, defying countless sieges. The citizens of Constantinople, proud heirs to Rome, likely felt an almost unshakable sense of security. Little did they know that the greatest threat to their city would not come from the traditional enemies in the East, but from those who claimed to be fellow Christians, marching under the banner of the cross. This is where the story gets truly ugly, and why historians still argue whether the Fourth Crusade was a tragic accident or a cynical plot from the very beginning. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202 CE, was ostensibly aimed at liberating Jerusalem from Muslim control. However, it quickly went awry, spiraling into a morally dubious adventure driven by Venetian ambition, internal Byzantine dynastic squabbles, and the Crusaders' overwhelming financial woes. The Crusaders, heavily indebted to the Venetians for transport, found themselves diverted from their original holy mission. First, they were convinced to attack the Christian city of Zara, modern Zadar, on the Adriatic coast, a rival of Venice, which earned them excommunication from the Pope. Not exactly a great start for a holy war, right? Then came the truly shocking turn of events. A deposed Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, promised the Crusaders vast sums of money, military aid for the crusade, and even the reunion of the Eastern and Western churches under papal authority, if they would help him reclaim his throne in Constantinople. The Crusaders, seeing a golden opportunity to resolve their debts and gain immense wealth, agreed. So in 1203 CE, a Crusader army that was supposed to be fighting Muslims in the Holy Land found itself outside the mighty walls of Christian Constantinople. This was an unprecedented act, an almost unthinkable violation of Christian solidarity, and the Byzantines simply couldn't believe their eyes. The initial siege in 1203 CE led to the restoration of Alexios Angelos, but his promises proved impossible to keep. The Byzantines, already suspicious of the Latins, grew resentful of the new emperor and his Western allies. Tensions escalated, and in 1204 CE, the situation exploded. The Crusaders, frustrated by unpaid debts and provoked by Byzantine resistance, launched a full-scale assault on Constantinople. After a surprisingly difficult fight, even the Venetians struggled to breach those ancient defenses. They breached the walls. What followed was a 3-day horror show, a systematic, brutal sack of Constantinople. Imagine the scene. A city that had been the repository of 1,000 years of Roman and Christian heritage. A city filled with priceless ancient artifacts, magnificent churches, and libraries overflowing with knowledge, subjected to indiscriminate looting, burning, and desecration. The Crusaders, driven by greed, religious fanaticism, and a profound lack of discipline, plundered everything they could lay their hands on. Churches were ransacked, relics were stolen, and priceless works of art, including ancient bronze statues from the Hippodrome, were melted down for coin. Even the great Hagia Sophia was desecrated, its altar smashed, its holy icons defiled, and prostitutes reportedly paraded through its sacred spaces. The human cost was immense. Thousands were killed, raped, or enslaved. It was an act of barbarity that shocked even some contemporary Western observers. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 CE was a catastrophe of unparalleled proportions for Byzantium. It wasn't just a physical destruction, it was a psychological and political death blow. the Byzantine Empire ceased to exist as a unified entity. In its place, the Crusaders established the Latin Empire of Constantinople, with a Frankish emperor on the throne, carving up the remaining Byzantine territories into feudal states. The Byzantine aristocracy and remnants of the imperial court fled, establishing successor states in exile, notably the Empire of Nicaea, the Despotate of Epirus, and the Empire of Trebizond. This event permanently weakened Byzantium, shattering its military, draining its wealth, and irrevocably undermining its moral authority and prestige. The schism between the Catholic and Orthodox churches, already centuries in the making, became almost unbridgeable, marked by deep-seated bitterness and a sense of betrayal that persists to this day. Historians still argue whether the sack of Constantinople was the true end of the Byzantine Empire, or if its later resurrection was a mere shadow. What is undeniable is that the Fourth Crusade inflicted a wound so deep that it never truly healed, leaving the once mighty empire a mere husk of its former self, paving the way for its ultimate demise centuries later. The unimaginable catastrophe of the Fourth Crusade, the brutal sack of Constantinople, and the subsequent establishment of the Latin Empire on Byzantine soil had seemingly brought an end to our millennium-long story. The once mighty Roman Empire of the East lay shattered, its capital occupied by foreign invaders, its territories carved up by greedy crusaders and ambitious Venetian merchants. It was, without a doubt, the lowest point in Byzantine history, a betrayal so profound that it echoed for centuries. But here's the surprising twist. The Byzantine spirit, resilient and tenacious, refused to die. Like fragments of a broken mirror, three main successor states emerged, clinging to the imperial legacy and plotting their return. Our focus here is on the most successful of these, the Empire of Nicaea, where the flame of Byzantium was kept alive, nurtured, and eventually used to rekindle the imperial dream. Imagine the scene in the immediate aftermath of 1204. The Byzantine elite, the aristocracy, the clergy, and anyone who refused to live under Latin rule fled the conquered capital. They scattered to various corners of the former empire, establishing independent Greek states. There was the Despotate of Epirus in the west, clinging to the coast of modern-day Albania and Greece, and the Empire of Trebizond, a small independent state on the Black Sea coast, far to the east, which would remarkably survive until 1461, long after Constantinople fell again. But the true inheritor of the imperial mantle, the one with the strongest claim and the most strategic position, was the Empire of Nicaea. This state was founded by Theodore Lascaris, a son-in-law of the last pre-Crusade emperor, Alexios III Angelos. Theodore, a capable and determined leader, managed to consolidate control over a significant portion of Western Anatolia, with his capital at the city of Nicaea. Remember that city from the very first church council. It seems to have a knack for being historically significant. He shrewdly leveraged the support of the local Greek population, who resented the Latin invaders, and capitalized on the disunity among the various Latin feudal lords, who now occupied much of former Byzantine territory. It was a race against time, a scramble for survival against both external Latin enemies and internal Greek rivals. The emperors of Nicaea, though ruling a much reduced territory compared to the old empire, never ceased to see themselves as the legitimate Roman emperors, the true heirs of Constantine and Justinian. They maintained the elaborate court protocols, the intricate bureaucracy, and the deep-seated theological traditions of Constantinople. They were, in every sense, Byzantium in exile, biding their time, preparing for the inevitable return. This wasn't just wishful thinking. It was a carefully constructed political and ideological claim, essential for rallying support among the disheartened Orthodox populations. Historians still debate whether Nicaea's success was primarily due to the exceptional leadership of its early emperors, or the inherent weakness and disunity of the Latin Empire of Constantinople. It was likely a combination of both, a perfect storm for a Byzantine comeback. The Nicene emperors, particularly Theodosius Lascaris and his successor John III Ducas Vatatzes, who ruled from 1222 to 1254, were remarkably effective. John III, in particular, was a true statesman. He was known for his wise administration, his fiscal responsibility, and his military successes. He built up a formidable army, including a significant contingent of Western mercenaries, and skillfully played off his Latin and Bulgarian rivals against each other. He reclaimed territory in the Balkans from Epirus and expanded Nicene control over parts of Thrace. He also understood the importance of economic stability, encouraging agriculture and discouraging reliance on foreign merchants. It was a pragmatic approach to rebuilding an empire from the ground up, proving that even in dire circumstances, astute leadership can make a profound difference. The Nicene period also saw a continuation of Byzantine cultural life, albeit on a smaller scale. Scholars and artists, refugees from Constantinople, found patronage in Nicaea, keeping alive the intellectual traditions of the empire. This continuity of culture, law, and imperial ideology was absolutely crucial. It meant that when the time came to retake the capital, there was a fully functioning, legitimate imperial government ready to step back into the Grand Palace. It wasn't just a dream. It was a meticulously maintained reality, waiting for its moment. The Latin Empire in Constantinople, meanwhile, was, to put it mildly, a bit of a shambles. It was constantly short on funds, plagued by internal disputes among its feudal lords, and struggling to maintain control over a hostile Greek population. The Venetians, who had taken control of vast swathes of Byzantine territory, were more interested in trade than in governing effectively. It was a fragile construct, built on conquest rather than legitimacy, and it began to crumble under the sustained pressure from Nicaea. The stage was set for the eventual reconquest. The Nicaean emperors strategically encircled the Latin Empire, cutting off its supply lines and gradually reclaiming more and more territory. The climax of this remarkable comeback story would arrive with Michael VIII, Palaiologos, who would finally fulfill the dream of generations. But before we get ahead of ourselves, it's important to appreciate the resilience of Nicaea. It wasn't just a place where Byzantines waited. It was a state that actively rebuilt its strength, preserved its identity, and systematically worked towards the restoration of its spiritual and political heart. This period proves that even when the light seems to have gone out, the embers of an empire can still glow, waiting for the right moment to ignite once more. The Empire of Nicaea, against all odds, had transformed itself from a mere refuge into a formidable power, meticulously rebuilding its military and economic strength, and patiently encircling the shaky Latin Empire in Constantinople. The flame of Byzantium, carefully nurtured in exile, was now burning brightly, ready to illuminate its ancient capital once more. This brings us to the pivotal moment of restoration. The dawn of the Palaiologan dynasty begins, and the dramatic recapture of Constantinople. However, as with many returns to glory, this one came with a sobering caveat. The empire that Michael VIII Palaiologos reclaimed was a mere shadow of its former self, smaller, poorer, and facing a rapidly changing and increasingly dangerous world. Imagine the atmosphere in Nicaea in the mid-13th century. There was an almost palpable sense of anticipation. The Latin Empire in Constantinople was clearly on its last legs, struggling with internal dissent, financial woes, and dwindling support from the West. The Nicaean emperors, especially the shrewd and ambitious Michael VIII Palaiologos, who became co-emperor in 1259 and sole emperor shortly after, knew their moment was coming. Michael was a master strategist, both on the battlefield and in the diplomatic arena. He understood that simply waiting for the Latin Empire to collapse wasn't enough. He needed to actively orchestrate its downfall and secure his own position as the legitimate restorer of the Roman legacy. The actual reconquest of Constantinople in 1261 CE was, ironically, almost comically anticlimactic. Certainly not the dramatic, bloody siege one might expect after decades of anticipation. Michael VIII had sent his general Alexios Strategopoulos with a relatively small force to scout the defenses of Constantinople. By sheer stroke of luck, or perhaps divine intervention, Alexios learned from local Greek peasants that the Venetian fleet, which normally guarded the city, was away on a raid, and a gate in the city walls was unguarded. Seizing the opportunity, Alexios and his men slipped into the city under the cover of darkness. The Latin defenders, caught completely by surprise, were overwhelmed by the small force and the sudden uprising of the Greek populace, who had suffered under Latin rule and eagerly joined the liberation. It was less a grand conquest and more a stealthy re-entry. The Latin emperor, Baldwin II, famously fled in his nightshirt, abandoning the city he had so poorly governed. On August 15, 1261, Michael VIII Palaiologos entered Constantinople in triumph. It was a moment of immense symbolic power, the culmination of 57 years of exile and struggle. He was crowned emperor in the Hagia Sophia, reconsecrated to Orthodox worship, a powerful declaration that the legitimate Roman Empire was back. The joy and relief throughout the Orthodox world were immense. It seemed as though the ancient prophecies of Rome's eternal endurance had been fulfilled. This triumphant return, however, masked a grim reality. Historians still argue whether the recapture of Constantinople was a strategic masterstroke or a Pyrrhic victory. Did bringing the capital back to its ancient seat exhaust the limited resources of the Nicaean state and expose the empire to greater threats? The empire that Michael VIII inherited, or rather reassembled, was a shadow of its former glory. Territorially, it was a fraction of its pre-1204 size, primarily consisting of parts of Thrace, Macedonia, and western Anatolia. Crucially, The rich economic powerhouses of the Greek islands, the Peloponnese, and much of the Black Sea coast remained in Latin or rival Greek hands. The city of Constantinople itself, once the dazzling jewel of the world, was a dilapidated mess. The Crusaders had systematically plundered its treasures, stripped lead from its roofs, and neglected its infrastructure. The population had dwindled, and large areas lay in ruins. It was a grand palace, but one that desperately needed repairs, and the new emperor had a severely limited budget. Michael the Eighth, a pragmatic and often ruthless leader, immediately set about the monumental task of rebuilding. He poured resources into restoring Constantinople, repopulating it, and repairing its vital defenses. He also faced immediate and pressing external threats. The Latin powers, especially Charles of Anjou, the ambitious king of Sicily, were determined to retake Constantinople and re-establish the Latin Empire. To counter this, Michael engaged in a complex and often controversial diplomatic game. He sought alliances with various Western powers and, most controversially, initiated negotiations for the reunion of the Orthodox and Catholic churches. This move, made at the Council of Lyon in 1274 CE, was a purely political maneuver aimed at preventing a new Western crusade against Constantinople. It was deeply unpopular with the Orthodox clergy and populace, who viewed it as a betrayal of their faith, and ultimately, it proved to be a diplomatic failure, never truly implemented. It highlighted the desperate measures the Palaiologan emperors were willing to take for survival. Economically, the empire struggled. The Venetian and Genoese maritime republics had firmly entrenched themselves in the Byzantine economy, dominating trade and siphoning off much of the empire's wealth through favorable treaties, often extorted during periods of weakness. Byzantium could no longer compete on the seas and was increasingly reliant on these foreign powers for naval support. The imperial treasury remained chronically strained, leading to constant devaluations of the currency. Militarily, the empire was forced to rely heavily on expensive foreign mercenaries, a testament to the decline of its own native forces. So the Palaiologan Restoration was a moment of immense triumph, a testament to Byzantine resilience and the enduring power of its imperial ideal. But it also marked the beginning of the end. The empire was now permanently weakened, surrounded by powerful, ambitious enemies, and facing internal challenges it often lacked the resources to overcome. The recapture of Constantinople bought the empire another 2 centuries of life, but it was a life defined by continuous struggle, slow decline, and the gathering storm of a new, formidable enemy that would ultimately bring about its final demise. The shadow of the Ottoman Turks was already beginning to loom large on the horizon. The Palaiologan dynasty, having miraculously reclaimed Constantinople and breathed new life into the Byzantine Empire, quickly discovered that resuscitation was far from a cure. The empire, though back in its spiritual and symbolic home, was a shadow of its former self, a mere regional power struggling to assert its authority amidst a complex web of Latin rivals, independent Greek despotates, and an ever-present internal struggle for power. But as if these problems weren't enough to contend with, a far more ominous and ultimately existential threat was rapidly consolidating its power directly on Byzantium's doorstep. A new force that would slowly but surely encircle and eventually consume the last vestiges of the Roman Empire. The emergence of the Ottoman threat. This wasn't just another barbarian tribe or a squabbling Western prince. This was a dynamic, expansionist, and incredibly well-organized power, destined to become the dominant force in the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries to come. Imagine the geopolitical landscape in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. While Byzantium was busy trying to rebuild Constantinople and fend off ambitious Westerners like Charles of Anjou, a new power was quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, rising in Anatolia. After the Battle of Manzikert, remember that catastrophic defeat in 1071. That battle had allowed various Turkish tribes to flood into Anatolia. Among these, in the northwest corner of Anatolia, near the Byzantine heartland, arose a small but increasingly powerful principality led by a charismatic figure named Osman Fon. These were the Osmanlis, or as we know them today, the Ottomans. They were a Ghazi state, meaning they were driven by a frontier warrior ethos, expanding the borders of Islam into Christian lands. This gave them an internal dynamism and religious fervor that made them incredibly effective against a fractured and tired Byzantium. The early Ottoman expansion was slow but relentless. They began by chipping away at the weakened Byzantine strongholds in Anatolia, often seizing fortresses and cities one by one. Unlike earlier Turkish groups, who sometimes assimilated or established more stable, less aggressive states, the Ottomans seemed to possess an almost insatiable appetite for expansion. Their location was strategically perfect, right across from the Byzantine territories in Europe, giving them easy access once they had consolidated their Anatolian gains. Byzantium, unfortunately, was often too preoccupied with internal civil wars, dynastic disputes, and managing its complex relations with Venice and Genoa to mount a unified, effective defense against this emerging danger. It was like trying to put out a small brush fire while your house was already ablaze from within. One of the key turning points came with the Ottoman capture of Bursa in 1326 CE. This strategically vital city, close to the Sea of Marmara, became the first major Ottoman capital and a springboard for further expansion into Byzantine territory. From there, they steadily advanced, taking Nicaea, our beloved Nicaean capital, in 1331 and Nicomedia in 1337. These were major blows as they represented the last significant Byzantine cities in Anatolia and deprived the empire of vital revenue and manpower. The once rich Anatolian heartland of Byzantium was now almost entirely under Turkish control, reducing the empire to little more than Constantinople and its immediate surroundings, along with scattered enclaves in Greece. But the real game changer occurred in the mid-14th century. The Ottomans, despite lacking a significant navy at this point, managed to cross into Europe, taking advantage of one of Byzantium's seemingly endless civil wars. Remember how we said the Palaiologan emperors had a knack for internal strife? Well, one of them, John VI Cantacuzene, actually invited Ottoman mercenaries to assist him in his power struggle. It was a fatal miscalculation, akin to inviting a wolf into your sheepfold. Once in Europe, the Ottomans got a taste for the fertile lands and strategic opportunities. Their permanent foothold in Europe began with the capture of Gallipoli in 1354 CE, following an earthquake that conveniently toppled its walls. This gave them a crucial bridgehead for further expansion into the Balkans. From Gallipoli, the Ottomans rapidly expanded their territories in Thrace and Macedonia. They systematically defeated the various Balkan states, the Serbs, Bulgarians, and other minor principalities, who were too disunited to present a common front against the disciplined and highly motivated Ottoman army. Battles like Kosovo in 1389 CE, though not directly involving Byzantium, demonstrated the Ottomans' overwhelming military superiority and cemented their control over the Balkans. Constantinople became increasingly isolated, a Christian island in a rising Ottoman sea. The city was surrounded, its land links to the remaining Byzantine enclaves in Greece severed. The Ottoman sultans, particularly Murad Turn and Bayezid Thurshma, actively pursued a policy of encirclement. They built fortresses, expanded their fleet, and imposed tribute on Byzantium, essentially reducing the emperor in Constantinople to a vassal. By the late 14th century, the Byzantine emperor was often forced to travel to the Sultan's court to pay homage and even provide military assistance to the Ottomans against other Christian powers. Imagine the humiliation. The once mighty Roman emperor, reduced to a glorified Ottoman provincial governor, barely holding on to his capital by the Sultan's sufferance. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines could have adopted a more aggressive or unified strategy against the early Ottomans, or if their internal divisions and overall exhaustion made their eventual fate almost inevitable. This relentless Ottoman expansion left the Byzantine Empire starved of resources, manpower, and hope. Constantinople, though still formidable behind its walls, was economically strangled. Its population continued to decline, and its prestige plummeted. The Ottoman threat was not just a military challenge. It was a psychological one, slowly extinguishing the light of Byzantium piece by agonizing piece, until only the capital remained, a solitary candle flickering in an encroaching darkness, awaiting its final inevitable fate. The ominous shadow of the Ottoman Empire had by now completely enveloped Byzantium. Constantinople, though still symbolically the capital of the Roman Empire, was in reality an isolated, beleaguered city-state, barely clinging to its existence amidst a vast and rapidly expanding Ottoman dominion. The emperor, once the most powerful ruler in Christendom, was reduced to a vassal, often forced to humble himself before the Sultan. But even as this external pressure mounted to an almost unbearable degree, the Byzantine Empire continued to inflict wounds upon itself, tearing at its own fabric through chronic internal strife. Civil wars, dynastic struggles, and profound social divisions constantly undermined any efforts at unified resistance, demonstrating a tragic inability to put aside internal squabbles, even when facing extinction. Imagine a patient, already critically ill, who keeps self-inflicting new injuries. That, sadly, was often the case for the late Byzantine Empire. The Palaiologan dynasty, despite having recaptured Constantinople, was plagued by an almost astonishing series of civil wars. These weren't mere palace coups. These were protracted, devastating conflicts that pitted emperor against emperor, father against son, and brother against brother. The most damaging of these was the Byzantine Civil War of 1341-1347, fought between the supporters of John V Palaiologos, who was still a child, and his regent, John VI Cantacuzenos. This wasn't just a political struggle. It evolved into a bitter social conflict, with Cantacuzenos representing the landed aristocracy, and John V's supporters, often backed by urban populaces and more reformist elements. This civil war was an unmitigated disaster for the empire. Both sides, desperate for military advantage, repeatedly invited foreign powers to intervene on their behalf. John Cantacuzenos, in particular, famously or infamously, depending on your perspective, invited the Ottoman Turks to fight for him. Remember that fateful decision? It was this short-sighted expediency that gave the Ottomans their first permanent foothold in Europe at Gallipoli in 1354 CE. It was like inviting a gang of robbers into your house to help you settle a family dispute, only for them to decide they rather like your house and decide to stay. Historians still argue whether these internal conflicts were primarily driven by personal ambition, genuine ideological differences, or the deep-seated structural issues of the empire. Probably a bit of all three, seasoned with a dash of self-destructive pride. The civil wars ravaged the already diminished Byzantine territories. Armies crisscrossed the countryside, pillaging villages, destroying infrastructure, and disrupting trade. Cities that had survived the Ottoman advance were now laid waste by fellow Byzantines. The empire's tax base, already precarious, plummeted even further. Manpower, desperately needed for defense, was squandered in internecine bloodshed. The military, which relied on mercenaries due to the decay of the old theme system, became even more expensive and unreliable as commanders switched allegiances based on who paid them more. Beyond dynastic squabbles, the empire was also deeply divided by religious tensions. The attempts by several Palaiologan emperors, most notably Michael VIII and John the Whittle, to seek union with the Roman Catholic Church. Remember the Council of Lyon? In exchange for Western military aid, were met with furious opposition from the vast majority of the Orthodox clergy and populace. The saying, "better the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's hat," encapsulated this deep-seated sentiment. To many Byzantines, the Latins were not merely schismatics, but heretics, and the memory of the Fourth Crusade's brutal sack of Constantinople still burned brightly. This religious divide meant that even when the empire faced its gravest external threats, it could not present a united front, internally fracturing its resolve. The fragmentation of power also extended beyond the capital. Various Byzantine enclaves, like the Despotate of Morea in the Peloponnese, effectively became semi-independent entities, often pursuing their own foreign policies and even engaging in minor conflicts with Constantinople. While some despots were capable rulers, this decentralization further weakened the empire's ability to muster a unified response to the Ottoman onslaught. It was a classic case of too many cooks spoiling the broth, except the broth was the last remnants of an empire. Economically, the internal strife only deepened the crisis. The Venetians and Genoese, those clever Italian maritime republics, cleverly exploited the Byzantine weaknesses, playing one faction against another to secure ever more favorable trade concessions. They established fortified trading posts within Constantinople itself, essentially creating foreign enclaves where they controlled commerce, further marginalizing Byzantine merchants and draining the empire's remaining wealth. The Byzantine government, desperate for funds, often had to borrow from these very powers at exorbitant interest rates. It was a vicious cycle of dependency. The cumulative effect of these internal struggles was devastating. The civil wars exhausted the empire's last reserves of men and money, making it utterly incapable of mounting a serious defense against the Ottoman Empire. They created a power vacuum that the Ottomans expertly exploited, picking off weakened Byzantine territories one by one. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the Byzantine Empire was less an empire and more a city-state, surrounded by its powerful Ottoman overlords, slowly being strangled into submission. Its internal divisions ensured that even the most desperate pleas for aid from the West would fall on deaf ears, as Europe saw an empire that seemed determined to destroy itself from within. The relentless internal strife and the ever-tightening grip of the Ottoman Empire had reduced Byzantium to a critical state, a mere husk of its former glory. Constantinople, though still grand in its decaying magnificence, was little more than an isolated island in a vast Ottoman sea, its emperor a nominal ruler with rapidly dwindling authority. As the walls closed in, the Byzantines, desperate and facing utter annihilation, turned to the one power that might still be able to offer salvation, albeit a reluctant one: Western Europe. This brings us to a period of increasingly frantic Western appeals for aid, a series of diplomatic missions where Byzantine emperors swallowed their pride, overcame centuries of religious and cultural animosity, and pleaded for military assistance against the relentless Ottoman advance. It was a true diplomatic tightrope walk, fraught with suspicion and deep-seated prejudice on both sides. Imagine the emperors in Constantinople during the late 14th and early 15th centuries. They were Roman emperors, heirs to a 1,000-year legacy, yet they were forced to embark on humiliating journeys to the courts of Western monarchs, men they often considered semi-barbaric, or, at best, unsophisticated. The Byzantine court, with its elaborate ceremonies and profound sense of superiority, had to literally beg for help from those it had long disdained. It was a bitter pill to swallow, a testament to the sheer desperation of their situation. The primary leverage the Byzantines held, their trump card in these appeals, was the potential for church union. Remember the Great Schism of 1054 and the Fourth Crusade in 1204, which cemented the deep divide between the Orthodox East and the Catholic West? Well, for the popes and many Western rulers, the prospect of reuniting Christendom under the Pope's authority was a powerful incentive. The Byzantine emperors, recognizing this, periodically offered union, knowing full well it would be met with fierce resistance back home by their own deeply conservative clergy and populace. It was a classic damned if you do, damned if you don't situation: offer union and risk internal revolt, refuse and face Ottoman conquest. Historians still argue whether these appeals for aid were genuine attempts at reconciliation or cynical diplomatic ploys. In truth, they were likely a desperate mix of both. One of the most famous of these appeals came in 1369 CE, when Emperor John V Palaiologos traveled to Rome. Yes, the Roman emperor, traveling to Rome, but not to rule, to beg. He publicly converted to Catholicism, kneeling before the Pope and acknowledging papal supremacy, all in the desperate hope of securing military aid. While he was received with great pomp and ceremony, and personal assurances were given, no significant military help materialized. The Western powers, grappling with their own internal conflicts, like the 100 Years' War between England and France, and often deeply suspicious of Byzantine motives, rarely committed substantial resources. They also saw the Byzantines as weak and unreliable, and perhaps even felt that the Byzantines deserved their fate for their alleged heresies and perceived pride. Later, in 1399 CE, Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos embarked on an even more extensive tour of Western Europe, visiting Venice, Milan, Paris, and even London. Imagine the spectacle. The elegant, erudite Byzantine emperor, with his sophisticated court, traversing medieval Europe, pleading his case. He was received with curiosity and some sympathy. But again, concrete military assistance was fleeting. While he secured promises and some small detachments of knights, the scale of the Ottoman threat was simply too immense for fragmented Western efforts to counter effectively. The West's attention was divided, its resources limited, and its commitment to saving Byzantium far from absolute. The challenges were numerous. First, the enormous geographical distance and logistical difficulties of launching a major crusade to the east. Second, the constant internal conflicts within Western Europe itself meant that rulers rarely had the leisure or the resources to commit to such a far-flung and costly venture. Third, the deep religious prejudice. Many Westerners, particularly after the Fourth Crusade, viewed the Byzantines with disdain, seeing them as schismatics who had brought their troubles upon themselves. The prospect of military aid was often tied directly to demands for Byzantine submission to Rome, a condition that the Orthodox population overwhelmingly rejected. Despite the failures to secure large-scale military intervention, these appeals for aid weren't entirely without effect. They kept the Ottoman threat on the European agenda and occasionally led to small-scale crusades, such as the disastrous Crusade of Nicopolis in 1396 CE. This crusade, primarily composed of French, Hungarian, and Wallachian forces, was utterly annihilated by the Ottomans, serving as a grim reminder of Ottoman military superiority and the dangers of poorly coordinated Western efforts. It was a crushing blow to any lingering hopes of a large-scale Western rescue. The desperate pleas of the Byzantine emperors underscored the profound shift in the balance of power. Byzantium, once the supreme power, was now a supplicant. The West, once seen as barbaric, was now the arbiter of its fate. These appeals laid bare the deep fissures in Christendom and the harsh realities of geopolitical power. The Byzantines tried every possible avenue, every desperate gamble, including sacrificing their religious independence. But the aid was too little, too late, and often came with too many strings attached. The stage was being set for one final monumental effort to save Constantinople, an effort that would bring the two halves of Christendom together one last time, with the ultimate fate of the Roman Empire hanging precariously in the balance. The desperate appeals for aid to the West, despite the heroic efforts of emperors like Manuel II, had largely fallen on deaf ears, or at best, secured only token assistance. The Ottoman noose around Constantinople was tightening inexorably, and the empire's internal divisions, particularly over the question of church union, continued to fester. Yet as the final curtain began to descend on Byzantium, one last monumental effort was made to bridge the schism between East and West, a grand gamble that combined religious idealism with stark political necessity. This brings us to the Council of Florence, a last-ditch attempt for religious unity that, while achieving a fleeting agreement, ultimately met with mixed results and profound popular rejection, showcasing the deep chasm that had formed over centuries. Imagine the atmosphere in the early 15th century. The Ottoman Empire, under dynamic sultans like Murad II, was aggressively consolidating its grip on the Balkans, preparing for the final assault on Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor, John VIII Palaiologos, a man of intellectual curiosity and pragmatic desperation, understood that military aid from the West was the only thing that could save his empire. And the price of that aid, as had been clear for decades, was submission to the Pope and the formal reunion of the churches. This wasn't a choice. It was a perceived necessity, a calculated risk, though one fraught with immense spiritual peril for the Orthodox faithful. So, in 1438 CE, Emperor John VIII, accompanied by a truly remarkable delegation of Byzantine religious and intellectual leaders, including the Patriarch of Constantinople and renowned scholars like Bessarion and Mark of Ephesus, embarked on a long, arduous journey to Italy. Think of it. The Emperor of the Romans, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the cream of Byzantine scholarship, traveling across Europe not in triumph, but in a desperate plea. Their destination was the city of Ferrara, where the council initially convened, later moving to the more luxurious city of Florence. This wasn't just a political summit. It was a profound theological debate, bringing together the intellectual and spiritual leaders of both Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. The Council of Florence, 1438-1445 CE, was a monumental undertaking. For years, delegates from both East and West debated the core theological differences that had driven them apart. The Filioque Clause, the addition of "and the Son" to the Nicene Creed regarding the procession of the Holy Spirit, the nature of purgatory, papal supremacy, and the use of leavened versus unleavened bread in the Eucharist. These weren't minor squabbles. They were deeply held doctrinal differences, rooted in centuries of diverging theological development and cultural understanding. The debates were often fierce, intellectually rigorous, and incredibly draining. The Byzantine delegation, housed in cramped quarters and often facing financial hardship, was under immense pressure from the emperor to reach an agreement, any agreement that would secure Western military intervention. After prolonged and intense negotiations, often driven by political expediency rather than genuine theological consensus, a formal Act of Union was finally signed on July 6, 1439 CE, at Florence. The Decree of Union, known as Letento Caeli, Let the Heavens Rejoice, declared the reunion of the churches, affirming papal supremacy and offering compromises on most of the theological points. The Byzantine delegation, with the notable exception of the staunchly Orthodox Mark of Ephesus, who famously refused to sign, becoming a hero to many Orthodox later, agreed to the terms, hoping that this unprecedented concession would finally unlock the floodgates of Western aid. Imagine the mixed feelings of triumph and despair as they put their names to a document that fundamentally altered centuries of tradition. From the perspective of Emperor John VIII, the council was a success. He had achieved the union, the prerequisite for a crusade. From the Pope's perspective, it was a long-sought triumph for papal authority. However, the mixed results became glaringly apparent almost immediately upon the Byzantine delegation's return to Constantinople. The Union of Florence was, to put it mildly, deeply unpopular with the vast majority of the Byzantine clergy, monks, and the common people. They viewed it as a sellout of their Orthodox faith, a betrayal of their traditions, and a capitulation to Latin heresy. The memory of 1204 was too fresh, the theological differences too ingrained, and the mistrust of Western motives too profound. The union was never truly accepted by the Byzantine populace. The Orthodox clergy who had signed it were often ostracized, and services commemorating the union were frequently boycotted. The patriarch who signed it died shortly after returning, and his successors struggled to enforce the union. It was, in essence, a paper union, enacted by an emperor out of desperation, but rejected by the very people it was supposed to save. Historians still argue whether the theological concessions made at Florence were truly compatible with Orthodox tradition, or a necessary, if painful, sacrifice for survival. It's a complex question that touches on faith, politics, and historical legacy. Despite the theological triumph for Rome and the political achievement for Byzantium, the promised large-scale military aid never fully materialized. A new crusade was indeed launched, the Crusade of Varna in 1444 CE, led by King Ladislaus III of Poland and Hungary. But this ill-fated expedition was decisively crushed by the Ottomans at the Battle of Varna, a devastating defeat that annihilated the last significant Western military effort to save Byzantium. This signaled the definitive end of any realistic hope for a large-scale Western rescue. The Council of Florence, therefore, was a tragic last hurrah. It highlighted the desperate straits of the Byzantine Empire and its willingness to sacrifice deeply held beliefs for survival. It revealed the chasm between the imperial court's pragmatic view and the populace's unshakable religious conservatism, and ultimately, its failure to deliver substantial, timely military aid meant that Constantinople was now truly on its own, facing the inevitable final showdown with the relentless Ottoman war machine. The stage was set for the very last act, a desperate struggle for survival against overwhelming odds. The Council of Florence, for all its theological maneuvering and desperate hopes, had failed to materialize the decisive Western aid Byzantium so desperately needed. The defeat at Varna in 1444 CE had extinguished the last significant flame of hope for a large-scale Christian crusade. Now, the Byzantine Empire was truly on its own, a tiny, beleaguered remnant of its glorious past, reduced to a single city surrounded by a hostile and immensely powerful new empire. This brings us to the grim, inevitable climax of our story, the Siege of Constantinople in 1453. This wasn't just another siege. It was the final, desperate struggle for the very existence of the Roman Empire, a testament to courage against impossible odds, and a moment that forever changed the course of European and world history Imagine Constantinople in the spring of 1453. It was a city of ghosts, its population drastically reduced from its heyday, its once bustling streets now quiet and filled with a sense of foreboding. Yet its formidable walls, particularly the landward Theodosian walls, still stood as a symbol of defiance, a thousand-year testament to Byzantine engineering. But the Ottomans were no longer the disorganized raiders of old. They were a sophisticated, highly organized military machine, led by a young, brilliant, and utterly determined Sultan, Mehmed II, often called the Conqueror. Mehmed, only 21 years old, had one burning ambition: to capture Constantinople, the symbolic heart of the Christian world, and the last bastion of the Roman Empire. He knew that owning Constantinople would cement his empire's legitimacy and give him unparalleled prestige. Mehmed's preparations for the siege were meticulous and unprecedented. He spent years planning, gathering resources, and developing new technologies specifically for breaching Constantinople's legendary defenses. His most significant innovation was the casting of enormous cannons, far larger than anything seen before. The largest of these, the Basilica, was a monstrous siege gun, reportedly 27 feet long, capable of firing a 200-pound stone ball over a mile. Imagine the sheer logistical nightmare of transporting and operating such a weapon. It was a terrifying piece of artillery designed to shatter the impregnable. Historians still argue whether the Basilica was as effective as contemporary accounts claim, often suffering from internal fractures, but its psychological impact was undeniable. On the Byzantine side, Emperor Constantine the Palaiologos faced a truly dire situation. He had perhaps only 7,000, 8,000 fighting men, including around 2,000 foreign mercenaries, against an Ottoman army estimated to be between 80,000 and 150,000 strong. It was a staggering disparity in numbers. Yet Constantine the Fourth, despite his impossible odds, displayed remarkable courage and resolve. He worked tirelessly to organize the city's defenses, repair sections of the walls, and rally his disheartened populace. He received some token aid from Venice and Genoa, notably a contingent of skilled Genoese marines led by the legendary Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, whose presence provided a much-needed morale boost and crucial engineering expertise. The siege began on April 6, 1453. For nearly 2 months, the city endured a relentless barrage. Ottoman cannons pounded the land walls, creating breaches that Byzantine defenders desperately patched up each night. The sea walls were attacked by the Ottoman navy, which, in one of the siege's most astonishing feats, was partly moved overland on creased logs from the Bosphorus into the Golden Horn, the city's natural harbor, bypassing the Byzantine chain that blocked the entrance. Imagine dragging dozens of ships over hills for miles. It was a feat of engineering ingenuity and sheer brute force that caught the Byzantines completely off guard and allowed the Ottomans to attack the weaker sea walls. The defenders fought with incredible bravery, repelling multiple assaults and inflicting heavy casualties on the Ottomans. Giustiniani Longo, the Genoese commander, was particularly instrumental in organizing the defense of the critical land walls, often leading counterattacks himself. The Byzantines were motivated not just by loyalty to their emperor, but by a desperate conviction that they were defending the last bastion of Christian civilization against an overwhelming tide. They also hoped, almost until the very last moment, that a miracle, a grand Western fleet, would appear on the horizon to save them. However, the tide was inexorably turning. Justiniani Longo was severely wounded, demoralizing the defenders. Breaches in the walls became harder to repair, and exhaustion set in. Mehmed II launched his final all-out assault on May 29, 1453. The Ottoman forces, wave after wave of them, attacked the weakest points of the land walls. The fighting was desperate and hand-to-hand. Emperor Constantine IV, rejecting any thought of escape, reportedly stripped off his imperial insignia and led a final charge alongside his men, falling in battle. His body never definitively identified. It was a hero's end for the last Roman emperor. The fall of Constantinople was not just the end of a city, it was the end of the Roman Empire, a continuous political entity that had spanned over 2,200 years. The city, once the magnificent jewel of Christendom, was subjected to a final tragic sacking by the Ottoman forces. The Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque, a powerful symbol of the new order. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves across Europe, marking a psychological turning point and signaling the unquestionable rise of the Ottoman Empire as a major European power. It was an event that literally defined the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern period for many historians. The dream of Rome, once thought eternal, had finally, definitively, come to an end. The final agonizing fall of Constantinople on May 29, 1453, marked not just the end of a siege, but the dramatic, conclusive end of the Roman Empire, a continuous political and cultural entity that had endured for an astonishing 2,200 years. It was a moment etched into the annals of history, a date that for many signals the close of the Middle Ages and the dawn of a new era. We've talked about the preparations, the defiance, and the overwhelming odds. But now let's delve deeper into the final fall itself, the last moments of the empire, and the immediate, devastating consequences that reverberated across Christendom and set the stage for centuries of Ottoman dominance. Imagine the dawn of May 29th. The Ottoman army, fueled by the promise of plunder and the fervent belief in Ghazi warfare, launched its final massive assault. Sultan Mehmed II, driven by an almost messianic zeal, had promised his troops 3 days of unrestricted looting once the city fell, a powerful incentive for the tired but determined soldiers. The attack came in waves, each designed to wear down the defenders. First came the irregular troops, the Bashi Bazouks, a motley collection of mercenaries and volunteers whose sheer numbers were meant to exhaust the Byzantine lines. Then came the Anatolian Turks, disciplined and numerous, followed by the elite Janissaries, the Sultan's highly trained infantry, who were the true shock troops of the Ottoman army. It was a relentless, meat-grinder assault designed to break the will of the defenders through sheer attrition. On the Byzantine side, Emperor Constantine V Palaiologos, the last Roman emperor, stood firm. He had rejected all calls for him to flee, famously declaring that he would rather die with his city than live without it. His final hours are shrouded in a mix of historical fact and heroic legend, but all accounts agree on his courage. Dressed in his imperial regalia, or perhaps having cast them aside for a soldier's simple armor, he was seen leading the defense at the crucial section of the land walls, fighting desperately alongside his remaining men. The Byzantine and allied Latin defenders, though utterly outnumbered and exhausted, fought with the ferocity of those defending their homes, their faith, and the very last bastion of an ancient civilization. The Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani Longo played a pivotal role, leading the defense with tactical brilliance until he was grievously wounded by an Ottoman cannonball or arrow. His evacuation from the walls reportedly caused a significant drop in morale among the remaining defenders, a small crack that the Ottomans quickly exploited. The decisive breach came at the Kirkoporta Gate. According to some accounts, a small postern gate, perhaps left unlocked or poorly guarded, was discovered by Ottoman troops, who then managed to force their way inside. Other accounts suggest the main breach in the wall simply became too wide to defend. Regardless of the exact sequence, once Ottoman soldiers were inside the city walls, the defense quickly crumbled. The remaining Byzantine defenders, fighting fiercely street by street, were overwhelmed. Emperor Constantine IV, seeing the inevitable, discarded his imperial purple and plunged into the melee, fighting to the very last. His body was never definitively found or identified in the ensuing chaos. A poignant, almost mythical end for the last heir of Rome. The city, once breached, endured a horrific 3-day period of plunder and destruction. The Ottoman soldiers, according to custom and incentive, unleashed their fury on the populace. Churches were desecrated, including the majestic Hagia Sophia, which was immediately converted into a mosque with an imam leading prayers within hours of the conquest. Priceless artifacts, libraries of ancient manuscripts, and the accumulated treasures of 1,000 years were either destroyed, looted, or carried off. Thousands of citizens were killed, raped, or enslaved. The sheer scale of the devastation was immense, transforming the vibrant capital into a scene of carnage and desolation. It was a true tragedy, erasing centuries of continuous cultural and artistic development in a matter of days. The fall of Constantinople was not merely a local event. It sent shockwaves across Europe. For the Christian West, it was a moment of profound shock and mourning, the ultimate symbol of the advancing Ottoman threat. Pope Nicholas V called for a new crusade, but it was too late. The loss of Constantinople signaled the definitive end of the Pax Romana and the dawn of a new order where the Ottoman Empire was the undisputed superpower of the Eastern Mediterranean. It also had practical consequences. The control of the Bosphorus and Dardanelles by a hostile power severely impacted European trade routes to the east, spurring new efforts to find alternative sea routes to Asia, which, ironically, contributed to the age of exploration. The immediate aftermath saw Sultan Mehmed II, now known as Fatih, the Conqueror, making Constantinople his new capital. He immediately set about rebuilding and repopulating the city, inviting people of all faiths, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, to settle there, eager to restore its former glory as the heart of his burgeoning empire. The Hagia Sophia, a monument to Christian architectural genius, stood as a triumphant symbol of Ottoman power. The last vestiges of Byzantine authority beyond Constantinople, such as the Despotate of Morea and the Empire of Trebizond, would fall to the Ottomans in the following years, finally extinguishing the last flicker of the Roman lamp. The final fall of Constantinople was a pivotal moment, a stark reminder that even the grandest empires can crumble. It was the tragic culmination of centuries of internal decay, external pressures, and a final overwhelming assault by a superior military force. The dream of Rome, once thought eternal, had met its definitive end on the walls of its last great city, ushering in a new age defined by the rise of a powerful Islamic empire that would reshape the global balance of power for centuries to come. The smoke from the burning ruins of Constantinople had barely cleared, and the echoes of the Ottoman cannons still resonated across the Bosphorus. The Roman Empire, the eternal, the glorious, had finally irrevocably fallen. But 1,000 years of continuous existence, of unparalleled cultural and political influence, does not simply vanish into thin air. Even in its demise, the Byzantine Empire cast a long, profound shadow, leaving behind a monumental legacy of Byzantium that shaped not only the emerging Ottoman Empire, but also profoundly influenced Western Europe, the Slavic world, and the very foundations of Orthodox Christianity. Its death was not an erasure, but a transformation. Its ideas and achievements disseminated far and wide, often unknowingly, by those who had once been its rivals or even its conquerors. Imagine for a moment the sheer paradox. An empire often dismissed or misunderstood in Western narratives as merely the Eastern Roman Empire, somehow less Roman than its fallen Western counterpart. Yet it was Byzantium that preserved classical Greek and Roman learning, refined intricate legal systems, created breathtaking art, and maintained a continuous state for a millennium after Rome itself collapsed. The idea that this sophisticated civilization simply vanished is frankly absurd. It continued to exert immense influence long after 1453. One of the most immediate and profound impacts was on the Ottoman Empire itself. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror, consciously saw himself not just as a Muslim ruler, but as the heir to the Roman Caesars. He adopted the title Kaiser-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome, and systematically incorporated Byzantine administrative structures, court rituals, and even some legal traditions into his burgeoning empire. Constantinople, now Istanbul, remained a magnificent imperial capital, its infrastructure restored, and its grand churches, like the Hagia Sophia, converted into mosques. The Ottomans learned from Byzantine military tactics, architectural techniques, and bureaucratic organization. It was a fascinating case of the conqueror absorbing aspects of the conquered, acknowledging the sheer power of the Byzantine legacy. In a strange twist, a part of the Roman Empire continued to live on, albeit under a different banner and faith. Historians still argue whether the Ottomans truly inherited the Roman mantle or merely adopted its symbols for legitimacy. Perhaps it was a pragmatic embrace of effective systems, sprinkled with a touch of imperial aspiration. For Western Europe, the fall of Constantinople, while mourned, also provided a curious silver lining: the forced migration of Byzantine scholars. As the Ottoman threat grew and then conquered, many learned Byzantines, laden with precious Greek manuscripts, fled westward to Italy, particularly during the Italian Renaissance. These scholars brought with them a treasure trove of classical Greek texts, the works of Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, and countless others that had been lost or forgotten in the Latin West. This influx of knowledge, direct from the source, had an electrifying effect on Western intellectual life, greatly contributing to the humanist movement and fueling the Renaissance. Imagine a sudden flood of forgotten wisdom, sparking new ideas and challenging old assumptions. It was almost as if Byzantium, in its death throes, delivered one last invaluable gift to the awakening West. The Slavic world, particularly the burgeoning states of Eastern Europe, owed an even more direct and profound debt to Byzantium. The conversion of the Russes to Orthodox Christianity in the 10th century, largely at the behest of Byzantine missionaries like Cyril and Methodius, who developed the Cyrillic alphabet, still used today, fundamentally shaped their culture, religion, and political identity. Moscow, after the fall of Constantinople, began to claim the mantle of the Third Rome, seeing itself as the legitimate successor and protector of Orthodox Christianity. Byzantine art, architecture, legal concepts, and even court ceremonial deeply influenced Russian, Bulgarian, and Serbian states. The legacy of Byzantium can be seen in the onion domes of Russian churches, the intricate iconography, and the strong ties between state and church in many Eastern European nations. It was a vast cultural and spiritual empire that extended far beyond its political borders. And then there's the enduring spiritual legacy, Orthodox Christianity. While the political empire fell, the Orthodox Church, centered now on the ecumenical patriarchate in Istanbul under Ottoman rule, and the various autocephalous national churches, continued to thrive. Byzantine theology, liturgy, monastic traditions, and spiritual understanding became the bedrock of Eastern Christianity, influencing millions of believers worldwide. The very distinctive art form of the icon, whose veneration had caused so much strife during iconoclasm, became even more central to Orthodox worship, a tangible link to Byzantium's artistic and spiritual genius. So while the political entity, known as the Byzantine Empire, ceased to exist in 1453, its impact continued to ripple outwards, shaping empires, sparking intellectual awakenings, and defining religious identities for centuries. It was not a simple death, but a complex, multifaceted legacy, interwoven into the very fabric of global history, a silent testament to the enduring power of ideas, culture, and faith that truly transcended political boundaries. The profound legacy of Byzantium, as we've explored, wasn't merely a collection of dusty old legal codes or historical footnotes. It was a living, breathing influence that permeated various aspects of post-imperial life, particularly in the realms of art and architecture. Even after its political demise, the visual language and innovative construction techniques developed within the empire continued to inspire, shaping the aesthetic sensibilities of both its successors and those who looked to its past glories. Our focus now turns specifically to Byzantine art and architecture, a unique aesthetic heritage that still captivates us today, showcasing a blend of Roman grandeur, Eastern mysticism, and Hellenistic elegance, all filtered through the lens of profound Christian faith. Imagine stepping into a Byzantine church, even today. What strikes you? Is it the dazzling mosaics, glinting with gold leaf, depicting serene, elongated figures with enormous, soulful eyes? Or perhaps the sense of awe inspired by a massive dome seemingly floating above you, bathed in ethereal light. This wasn't accidental. It was carefully designed to transport the worshipper, to create a sense of the divine presence on earth. Byzantine art was, first and foremost, sacred art, serving a spiritual purpose. It wasn't about realistic depiction in the Western sense, but about conveying divine majesty and spiritual truth. This often meant stylized frontal figures, less interested in naturalism and more in symbolic representation. The centerpiece of Byzantine architectural innovation, and perhaps its most enduring gift to the world, is the dome. Remember the Hagia Sophia. We spoke about its colossal dome, a daring engineering feat for its time. While the Romans had mastered the dome, the Byzantines perfected the technique of placing a circular dome over a square base using pendentives. Those clever, triangular, curving supports that transfer the weight of the circular dome to the four corners of the square below. This allowed for vast, open interior spaces, flooded with light from windows at the base of the dome, creating an otherworldly effect. It was an architectural magic trick, making heavy stone appear weightless. Historians still argue whether the invention of the pendentive was a gradual evolution or a stroke of individual genius. But its impact on church architecture was revolutionary. This mastery of domed basilicas and central plan churches spread throughout the Orthodox world. Look at St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, heavily influenced by Byzantine models, or the numerous churches across Russia, Bulgaria, and Greece, and you'll see the direct descendants of Hagia Sophia's genius. The interior of these buildings was designed to be a shimmering jewel box. Forget plain stone walls. The Byzantines adorned their churches with an astonishing array of mosaics. Made from tiny tesserae of glass, stone, and gold, these mosaics captured and reflected light in a way that paint simply couldn't. Imagine standing under a golden dome, light streaming through windows, making the mosaic images dance and glow. It was a visual feast designed to elevate the spirit, to create a tangible bridge between the earthly and the heavenly. These mosaics weren't just pretty pictures. They were theological statements depicting Christ Pantocrator, ruler of all, in the dome, surrounded by angels, saints, and scenes from the Gospels. Beyond mosaics, icons themselves, those painted wooden panels, became the distinctive art form of Eastern Christianity. Remember the Iconoclast Controversy? The very ferocity of that debate underscores the profound importance of icons to the Byzantine faithful. They were believed to be conduits to the divine, not objects of worship themselves, but sacred tools for prayer and veneration. The stylized faces, the large eyes, the often somber expressions, all were meant to evoke a sense of the sacred, to transcend the earthly and connect with the spiritual. These traditions, perfected in Byzantium, continue to be central to Orthodox worship today. It's a living art form that directly links modern believers to their Byzantine past. Even in their textiles and luxury goods, the Byzantines excelled. Their silks, often embroidered with imperial symbols or religious scenes, were highly sought after across Europe and Asia, a testament to their sophisticated craftsmanship and artistic flair. Ivory carvings, enamels, and illuminated manuscripts further showcased their exquisite artistry, demonstrating a meticulous attention to detail, and a profound aesthetic sense. Imagine how a visiting foreign dignitary, perhaps from a rough and tumble Western kingdom, would have felt walking into the great palace of Constantinople, surrounded by such dazzling beauty and intricate workmanship. It must have felt like stepping into another world entirely. So the Byzantine artistic and architectural legacy is not merely something to be admired in museums, though it certainly is there. It's a profound testament to a civilization that understood the power of beauty to express faith and power. It shaped the visual landscape of Eastern Europe and influenced the Western Renaissance. It continues to inspire awe and devotion, reminding us that even in an age of decline and eventual fall, the creative spirit of Byzantium burned brightly, leaving behind a heritage of beauty and spiritual depth that truly transcends time. It's almost like they invented the very concept of bling. But for God, we've journeyed through the rise and fall of Byzantium, marveled at its architectural wonders, and understood the profound impact of its religious art. But an empire isn't just about walls and churches, it's also about knowledge. And in this regard, Byzantium played an absolutely crucial, though often unsung role. It acted as a living library, the great preserver of classical antiquity. Our next focus, then, is on Byzantium's vital function in the preservation of knowledge, safeguarding the intellectual treasures of ancient Greece and Rome, ensuring that countless works of philosophy, science, literature, and history survive the long night of the early Middle Ages in the West, ready to be rediscovered and ignite new intellectual revolutions. Imagine a time when books weren't mass-produced, when knowledge was fragile, easily lost to war, neglect, or deliberate destruction. In the chaotic centuries following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, much of classical learning in Latin Europe simply vanished. Monasteries might have preserved fragments, but comprehensive scholarship dwindled. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, deeply proud of their Hellenic heritage, meticulously collected, copied, studied, and commented upon the works of ancient Greek authors. It was like they ran the world's most diligent and long-lasting historical preservation society, keeping the intellectual lights burning when much of the rest of the continent was in relative darkness. The Byzantines considered themselves the direct heirs to ancient Greek civilization. They spoke Greek, read Greek, and venerated the intellectual giants of Athens and Alexandria. Throughout the Byzantine millennium, scholars in Constantinople and other major cities diligently copied manuscripts, often by hand in scriptoria, those quiet rooms in monasteries or imperial libraries where scribes painstakingly reproduced texts. This wasn't just rote copying. It involved careful collation of different versions, textual criticism, and the production of commentaries and encyclopedias. Think of it as intellectual curation on a grand scale, ensuring the continuity of thought and the preservation of irreplaceable texts. Historians still argue whether this was primarily an act of reverence for the past or a pragmatic decision to maintain the administrative and legal frameworks of a state built on classical foundations. It was probably a powerful blend of both. The scope of their preservation efforts was immense. They preserved the complete works of foundational Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, whose ideas would later profoundly influence both Islamic and Western thought. Imagine a world without these intellectual cornerstones. They preserved the tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides, the comedies of Aristophanes, and the epic poems of Homer. They kept alive the historical accounts of Herodotus and Thucydides, the medical writings of Galen, the mathematical and astronomical treatises of Euclid and Ptolemy. It wasn't just the good stuff. They preserved a vast array of texts, from obscure grammarians to practical handbooks, creating a comprehensive intellectual archive. These efforts weren't always smooth sailing, of course. There were periods of decline, like the Arab conquests and the Iconoclast Controversy, which sometimes led to the destruction of non-religious texts as well. But overall, the tradition of scholarship endured. Key figures like Photios I, a 9th century patriarch of Constantinople, compiled a vast bibliography known as the Myriobiblos, which summarized over 280 works, many of which are now lost to us except for Photios' summaries. It's almost like he created the world's first rotten tomatoes for ancient literature, except far more scholarly and useful. This demonstrated an active engagement with and critical analysis of the past, not just a passive preservation. The transmission of this knowledge occurred through several channels. During periods of interaction, particularly the Crusades, some Latin scholars in the West gained access to Greek manuscripts and translations. But the most significant transfer happened after the fall of Constantinople. As we touched upon earlier, Byzantine scholars fleeing the Ottoman conquest migrated to Italy, bringing their precious libraries with them. This influx of Greek texts and Greek-speaking scholars provided a direct, unfiltered connection to ancient Greek thought, reinvigorating Western European scholarship and playing a pivotal role in the Italian Renaissance. It wasn't just new texts, it was a new way of thinking, a rediscovery of humanism and rational inquiry that had long been dormant in the West. So when we admire the works of Renaissance masters or delve into the philosophical depths of Plato, we owe a profound, often forgotten, debt to the anonymous Byzantine scribes and scholars who meticulously preserved these treasures through centuries of turmoil. Byzantium was the bridge, the vital link that ensured the continuity of classical civilization. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest contribution isn't always about grand conquests or architectural marvels, but about the quiet, persistent act of preserving the wisdom of the past for the benefit of future generations. Without Byzantium, our understanding of antiquity, and indeed the very trajectory of Western intellectual development, would be immeasurably poorer. They were the ultimate academic librarians, and they deserve a permanent place in our historical Hall of Fame. We've explored how Byzantium kept the flame of classical knowledge alive, a monumental achievement that enriched both East and West. But beyond ancient texts and artistic marvels, the Byzantine Empire bequeathed an even more fundamental and enduring legacy, the very heart and soul of Orthodox Christianity. While the political empire may have fallen, the spiritual empire, the unique theological and liturgical traditions nurtured within its borders, continue to thrive, shaping the religious lives of millions across Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and beyond, and becoming the definitive expression of Eastern Christian faith, Imagine the deeply intertwined relationship between church and state in Byzantium. It was far more integrated than in the Latin West. The emperor was not just a secular ruler. He was considered God's vice-regent on earth, the protector of the Orthodox faith, often even intervening in theological disputes. Remember iconoclasm? This concept of symphony or harmony between spiritual and temporal power, where the emperor and the patriarch ideally worked in concert, was a defining characteristic. This was not always harmonious, of course, leading to clashes and political maneuvering, but the ideal persisted. This deep intertwining meant that the empire's fate was seen as inextricably linked to its adherence to true Christian doctrine. The core tenets of Orthodox Christianity, as we know them today, were largely forged within the Byzantine Empire. The ecumenical councils, many of which were convened on Byzantine soil, like Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, and Chalcedon, formulated the foundational doctrines of the Trinity and the nature of Christ. These councils, where great theological minds debated and defined dogma, established the very framework of Christian belief that much of the world still adheres to. The Orthodox Church prides itself on maintaining the correct or original faith as established by these early councils, seeing itself as preserving the authentic traditions of early Christianity, uncorrupted by later Western developments. Historians still argue whether the Eastern Church's unwavering adherence to tradition was a strength that preserved orthodoxy or a weakness that sometimes stifled innovation. It's a bit of both, like a very old, very beautiful, and incredibly well-preserved tapestry. The Byzantine liturgy, particularly the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, developed into a rich, complex, and deeply spiritual form of worship. Imagine the sensory experience, the haunting chant of the choirs, the wafting incense, the flickering candlelight, the shimmering gold of the icons, and the intricate ritual of the service. It was designed to evoke a sense of heaven on earth, to transport the worshipper into the presence of the divine. This liturgical tradition, perfected over centuries in the grand churches of Constantinople, spread throughout the lands converted by Byzantine missionaries, and remains largely unchanged in Orthodox churches worldwide. It's a living, breathing connection to the Byzantine past, a continuity that often surprises visitors from other Christian traditions. Monasticism also played a crucial role. From the deserts of Egypt and Syria, monasticism flourished in Byzantium, with centers like Mount Athos becoming spiritual powerhouses. Monks were not just hermits. They were often intellectual leaders, scribes, icon painters, and fierce defenders of orthodoxy. During periods like iconoclasm, they exemplified the ascetic ideal and spiritual pursuit that was deeply valued in Byzantine society. And their influence extended far beyond the walls of their monasteries. Perhaps the most significant aspect of this religious legacy was the missionary activity that emanated from Byzantium. Remember Cyril and Methodius? These 9th century Byzantine brothers were instrumental in converting the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe to Orthodox Christianity. They translated the Bible and liturgical texts into Old Church Slavonic, developing the Glagolitic and later Cyrillic alphabets specifically for this purpose. This wasn't just a religious conversion. It was a cultural and civilizational infusion. It tied these nascent Slavic states, Bulgaria, Serbia, and most famously, Kiev and Rus, the precursor to modern Russia and Ukraine, directly to the Byzantine cultural sphere, rather than the Latin West. This Byzantine Commonwealth of Orthodox nations would endure for centuries, long after the fall of Constantinople. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the political head of Orthodox Christianity was gone, but the church itself continued. The ecumenical patriarchate remained in Istanbul, albeit under Ottoman rule, adapting to its new reality. But the mantle of protector of orthodoxy increasingly passed to other burgeoning Orthodox states, most notably Muscovy, which began to see itself as the third Rome after the fall of Constantinople. This idea that Moscow was the spiritual successor to Rome and Constantinople became a powerful ideological force in Russian history, linking its destiny directly to the Byzantine legacy. So the enduring legacy of Orthodox Christianity is in many ways the most profound and tangible contribution of the Byzantine Empire. It shaped the spiritual and cultural identity of vast regions of the world, providing a unique theological perspective, a rich liturgical tradition, and an artistic language that continues to inspire millions. It reminds us that even when empires fall, faith can endure, weaving its threads through centuries, maintaining a continuous link to a once glorious past. We've journeyed through the rise and fall of Byzantium, explored its foundational concepts, admired its art, celebrated its role as a preserver of knowledge, and acknowledged its profound spiritual legacy in Orthodox Christianity. Now, as our thousand-year saga draws to a close, it's time to consider something a little less historical fact and a little more atmospheric. It's about how the ghost of Byzantium, its complex echoes, still whispers in the modern world. Our final focus, then, is on modern echoes, how the Byzantine Empire, long after its political demise, continues to influence contemporary geopolitics, cultural identity, and even our own understanding of history in subtle, sometimes surprising ways. It's a reminder that truly great civilizations never really disappear. They simply transform, leaving behind an indelible mark on the global consciousness. Imagine for a moment the enduring symbolic power of Constantinople, now Istanbul. This city, sitting astride two continents, is a living testament to its Byzantine past. The majestic Hagia Sophia, once the greatest church in Christendom, then a mosque and for a period a museum, now functions as a mosque once more. This shifting identity is a potent symbol of competing historical narratives and the ongoing tug-of-war between East and West, secularism and faith that defines much of modern Turkey. The very stones of Istanbul whisper stories of Roman emperors, Christian patriarchs, and Ottoman sultans, a fusion of legacies that continues to shape its identity and its role in the world. It's a city that literally embodies historical layers, like a geological cross-section of empires. Think about the persistent tensions between the Orthodox East and the Catholic West. The Great Schism of 1054 and the catastrophic Fourth Crusade of 1204 weren't just historical events. They created a deep-seated mistrust and differing theological and cultural trajectories that still resonate today. You can see it in geopolitical alignments, in cultural differences, and sometimes even in religious rhetoric. The perception of the other, whether the barbaric Latin or the schismatic Greek, left scars that, while perhaps less prominent, still influence how regions and peoples interact. Historians still argue whether the divide between Eastern and Western Christianity is primarily theological or a result of geopolitical and cultural divergence. It's certainly a complex, interwoven story, like a tightly knotted rope. Then there's the concept of Byzantium itself. For a long time in Western scholarship, Byzantine was almost a derogatory term, synonymous with intrigue, decadence, and stagnation, a kind of historical eye roll. Byzantine politics still means overly complex, labyrinthine, and often Machiavellian. This negative portrayal, often perpetuated by later Western historians, painted the empire as a fossilized relic compared to the dynamic emerging states of Western Europe. However, modern scholarship has largely moved past this caricature, recognizing the Byzantine Empire for its remarkable resilience, its sophisticated administration, its vibrant culture, and its crucial role in preserving classical knowledge. The shift in academic perspective is an echo in itself, showing how history is constantly re-evaluated and how outdated biases can be overcome. It's almost as if the empire is getting a long overdue public relations makeover. Consider the notion of a third Rome. While Constantinople fell, the idea of a universal Christian empire, a successor to Rome, didn't. This concept found a powerful expression in Moscow, which declared itself the Third Rome after 1453. This ideology profoundly shaped Russian imperial ambitions, its self-perception as the protector of Orthodox Christianity, and its expansionist policies for centuries. Even today, echoes of this historical narrative can be seen in Russian geopolitical thinking and its cultural ties to Eastern Europe and the Middle East. It's a historical thread connecting the past to present-day international relations. And finally, Byzantium's ghost can be found in the subtle ways it shaped European identity. As a Christian bulwark against the East for 1,000 years, it protected Western Europe from numerous invasions, allowing its own distinct development. While often unacknowledged in the West, this protective shield was undeniably crucial. Its legal system influenced later European law, its art inspired new forms, and its scholarship, as we've noted, literally sparked a renaissance. It was the enduring bridge, the silent guardian, and its eventual fall had ramifications that reverberated across continents, indirectly shaping everything from trade routes to intellectual inquiry. So the Byzantine Empire may be gone from the political map, but its presence is undeniably felt. From the domes of Istanbul to the churches of Russia, from academic debates to subtle geopolitical currents, the echoes of Byzantium persist. It stands as a testament to human resilience, cultural endurance, and the profound, often invisible, threads that connect our present to a distant yet still vibrant past. Now, as the long night descends and the stories of emperors, warriors, and scholars begin to fade into the comforting darkness, imagine the city of Constantinople, resilient, enduring, a beacon of light against the vastness of time. Its walls, though silent now, still stand tall in your mind, guarding centuries of whispers. Feel the gentle sway of the ancient ships on the Bosphorus. Hear the distant, soothing chants from the Hagia Sophia, and let the quiet hum of history lull you into a peaceful slumber. The world of Byzantium, with all its complexities and splendors, has unfolded before you, a testament to the enduring human spirit. Let the weight of 1,000 years settle gently, reassuringly upon your thoughts, knowing that even in sleep, you carry a fragment of that vast, magnificent legacy within you. Rest now and dream of forgotten empires and timeless echoes.